Hello fellow Sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. I make these documentaries for people like you, the ones who are still awake, still thinking, still wondering. Whether you're getting ready to sleep, working late with headphones on, driving through the night, cooking dinner, or quietly spiralling in the shower, this is a space to slow down. What you'll find here isn't speculation, hype, or fast answers. It's soft science, built from archaeology, genetics, deep time, and the humble truth that sometimes we still don't know, but we can wonder together. If you appreciate this kind of storytelling, slow, thoughtful, and built to last, it really helps if you like the video or subscribe. That tiny click actually tells the algorithm that serious long-form education still matters, and maybe, just maybe, helps a few more sapiens out there learn something strange and beautiful about how we got here. You're always welcome to share how you use this kind of content. Is it part of your bedtime routine, something to focus with at work, a podcast for cooking, or maybe you're watching from some quiet corner of the world I'll never see? I'd love to know. And hey, if you drift off during one of the chapters, that's totally fine. I've added timestamps in the description, so you can pick the story up right where you left it the next day. Because this one's worth finishing. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now. Tonight's story begins long before kings, before clocks, before anything made of metal. It's the story of how we survived, for 3 million years, with nothing but stone. Let's begin. 3 million years ago, something quietly astonishing had already begun. But to understand it, we have to go back further, before chipped flint, before Homo, before anything recognizably human. We begin not with tools, but with trees, or rather, with the spaces between them. Around 7 million years ago, much of Africa was still green. Dense tropical forests stretched in every direction, especially in the equatorial regions. But change was underway. Tectonic shifts were reshaping the landscape, slowly tearing the East African rift apart. In the process, they lifted the highlands, rerouted rivers, and tilted ecosystems on their axis. The climate, once warm and consistently wet, grew patchier. Some regions dried out, others became seasonal. Forests began to fragment, opening up into mosaic habitats where woodlands met grasslands and tree cover thinned into open space. And it is here, in these unstable borderlands, that our story begins. In these mixed environments, one trait began to matter more than it had before: the ability to walk upright, not for long distances yet, not like a human, but upright enough to free the hands, upright enough to peek over tall grasses, upright enough to navigate between food patches or shaded groves. This was not yet a deliberate adaptation. It was an advantage forged by circumstance, and it is in this backdrop that we meet some of the earliest candidates in our lineage. Sahelanthropus chadensis, discovered in what is now Chad, lived about 7 million years ago. Its skull, with a flattened face and small canine teeth, suggests something transitional. Most intriguing is the placement of its foramen magnum, the hole where the spine connects to the skull. It sits closer to the centre than in chimps, hinting that this animal may have walked more upright than its forest-dwelling cousins. Still, we cannot say for sure. The fossil evidence is fragmentary, and the debates remain unresolved. Slightly later comes Aurorin tuganensis, around 6 million years ago, found in Kenya. Here the evidence grows more compelling. A partial femur shows signs of weight-bearing similar to that of later bipedal apes. Aurorin likely moved both in trees and on the ground, transitioning between two worlds that were both fading and forming. Then there is Ardipithecus, especially Ardipithecus ramidus, from about 4.4 million years ago, whose surprisingly complete skeleton offers a rare window into this twilight of ape and ancestor. Ardi, as she's nicknamed, had a grasping big toe suited for climbing, yet her pelvis and leg bones suggest she also walked upright when needed. She's not a chimpanzee, but she's not us either. What she represents is something else entirely. A branch adapting not to one world, but to two at once. Forests above, grasses below, survival in between. By the time we reach about 4 million years ago, these transitions begin to solidify in the form of Australopithecus. One of the most famous is Australopithecus anamensis, identified through fossilized jaw fragments and tibiae. Anamensis walked more consistently upright. Its teeth show wear from tougher foods, likely from open environments. This was no longer just an occasional biped. This was an ape increasingly shaped by the ground beneath it. Following closely is Australopithecus afarensis, appearing around 3.9 to 3 million years ago. Her name may not be familiar to all, but one of her skeletons is. She's called Lucy, and while this episode will revisit her in depth later, here we simply note what she represents. Not a tool user, not a fire maker, but a walker, a survivor of transition. The East African Rift Valley, from modern-day Ethiopia to Tanzania, was by now a corridor of evolutionary pressure. Volcanic activity shaped the soil. Cycles of drought and rain reshaped the fauna. Herbivores moved in patterns that required adaptation. Carnivores followed. And in this flux, early hominins thrived not by being the fastest or the strongest, but perhaps by being the most versatile. Bipedalism was not a destination. It was a compromise, a way to see above the grass without losing the trees, a way to carry what you could not afford to lose, a child, a root, a memory, while still being able to flee. But what made Africa ready for us was not just its shifting terrain. It was its complexity. These ancient landscapes forced problem-solving. They created distance between food sources, requiring planning and spatial memory. They exposed primates to seasonal shortages, demanding flexibility in diet. And perhaps, just perhaps, they fostered something harder to fossilize: social negotiation, cooperation, attention. The kind of mental adaptation that would later allow for culture, but that began with nothing more than the quiet, constant challenge of staying alive when nothing stayed the same. We do not have direct evidence for what these creatures thought or felt. We do not know if they saw themselves as different, or if they simply moved through the world as one organism among many. What we do know is that upright walking changed everything. It altered how the spine curved, how the pelvis balanced, how the legs extended. It allowed for the slow shrinking of the gut and the expansion of the brain, not all at once, but as a trade-off that would unfold over millions of years. But at this point in the story, none of that had happened yet. These apes were not inventors, they were not artists, they were not even Homo, but they were walking, and the earth was watching. To think of a world without us is to glimpse the possibility that we were never inevitable, that for every ancestor who survived, there were 1,000 who did not, that the line leading to us was just one of many experiments in locomotion, diet, and survival. The fossil record from this time is sparse and fragile. Teeth, partial femurs, a pelvis here, a skull there. From these we piece together gait, posture, and possibility, but not certainty. And that is the humility of this science. We can model forces, we can analyse bone density. But we cannot ask a 4-million-year-old skeleton what it dreamed about, if it dreamed at all. So what came before the Stone Age was not silence. It was the slow rehearsal of a body becoming something new. Not yet modern, not yet human, but walking, balancing, adapting. And in that movement, laying the invisible groundwork for everything that would follow: fire, tools, language, memory, even the idea of before. The haunting question is not why we began making tools, but why we were shaped to do so in the first place. What kind of world makes an ape into an ancestor? The answer, if there is one, may be hidden not in what we built, but in how we moved before we ever built anything at all. There is something strange about a cracked stone. If you found one on the ground today, you might step over it, assuming it had been broken by weather or accident. But 3,300,000 years ago, a single flake sliced clean off a river cobble in what is now Kenya, and someone noticed. Not just the sound it made, not just the shard that flew, but something more. An edge, a cut, a difference. And somewhere in that difference, something changed. It wasn't the first time a primate had used a rock. Other animals do that too. Chimps crack nuts, sea otters smash clams, even crows will drop stones to raise the water level in a pitcher. But this was different. This was not about using an object. This was about altering one. We do not know the name of the being who did it. It may not have been human at all. The site at Lomekwi in northwestern Kenya, dated to about 3,300,000 years ago, contains what are now the earliest known deliberately modified stone tools. Not found in association with Homo habilis, the traditional first human, but instead from a time when only Australopithecus and a mysterious genus called Kenyanthropus seemed to have existed in the region. If these early apes made these tools, it changes the entire story. It means tool-making came before humanity, or at least before the genus Homo. The Lemequian tradition, as it is now called, includes large, heavy stone cores, sharp flakes struck from them, and even anvils. These were not randomly broken rocks. They show percussion angles and fracture patterns that indicate deliberate flaking. Someone, over and over, struck one stone with another until a cutting edge emerged. This was not instinct. It was technique. There is a common temptation to draw a line from this behaviour directly to us, to say that the one who struck that first flake must have been trying to become human. But that is not how evolution works. The being who flaked that stone likely had no more idea of what it meant than a chimp, today, understands the physics of a hammer. What mattered was that it worked, that it allowed access to something new. At nearby sites of similar age, butchered animal bones have been found, long bones with cut marks and percussion damage. Someone, or something, was removing flesh from carcasses, breaking bones for marrow, tapping into a calorie source that had previously been locked away behind thick hide and tougher luck. This was not yet hunting. It was likely scavenging. Waiting until large predators finished their meal, then stepping in to clean up what was left. But with stone, cleanup became surgery. A sharpened flake could deflesh a limb faster than teeth or claws, and over time, this new advantage added up. By 2,600,000 years ago, the pattern became more consistent. At sites like Gona in Ethiopia, we begin to find a new style of stone tool, smaller, more refined, and more standardized. This is the beginning of what is called the Oldowan tradition, named after discoveries at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. Unlike the heavy Lemequian cores, Oldowan tools are more efficient. They consist of flakes, cores, and hammer stones, but the technique is now clearly intentional. Flakes are struck off with precision. Edges are used and resharpened. Some tools were even transported far from where they were made, suggesting foresight. The creatures behind these tools were not just reacting to opportunity, they were preparing for it. Who were they? Fossil evidence suggests the first Oldowan tools may have been made by early Homo species, likely Homo habilis, but possibly even Homo rudolfensis, or late Australopithecines. The bones and the stones don't always show up together, so there is still debate. What is not debated is that something had changed. This was no longer opportunistic smashing. This was cognitive. The leap here wasn't just the sharpness of the tools, it was the sharpness of thought. You had to understand that a stone could be broken in a certain way, with a certain gesture, at a certain angle, to create a functional result. That understanding had to be shared, mimicked, passed on. It is possible that the first human culture was not language, not art, not fire, but flaking. The flake as an idea, the sharp edge as a memory. It's difficult to describe just how much cognitive load is required for this kind of action. Fracture mechanics must be observed and then repeated. You must know which stones to choose, how to hold them, how much force to apply, and then you must have the patience to do it again and again until you have a working tool. It is a strange kind of intelligence. Not the intelligence of speech or numbers, but of hands, of muscle memory, of intention without symbols. This is the intelligence that would eventually build everything else. But here, in the Oldowan, it is still raw, still experimental. One thing worth noting is that Oldowan tools were not wildly diverse. Unlike modern toolkits, which include dozens of specialized objects, early toolmakers seemed content with a small set of forms. Cores, flakes, choppers, that was enough, and for over 1 million years it would remain enough. This is what archaeologists call technological stasis. To our modern minds, it can feel like stagnation, but that is a projection. In reality, it may represent a stable solution, a technology that did exactly what it needed to do in the environments where these beings lived. Most of these early sites are still concentrated in East Africa, in the Rift Valley regions of modern-day Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. This is no coincidence. The rifting process exposed rich deposits of both stone and fossil, making preservation more likely. But it also shaped the landscapes in which these hominins lived. Forests and grasslands overlapped in complex mosaics, and water sources shifted with the seasons. In this variable environment, flexibility was survival. A stone tool could be used to butcher a carcass, dig up tubers, or even crack nuts. The uses multiplied as the brains behind them did, and perhaps that's the point. The tools didn't just help these beings survive, they helped shape the brains that would later build cathedrals and space probes. Tool use and brain development are tightly linked in human evolution. The more we shaped our tools, the more they shaped us. Neural pathways for grip, coordination, planning, and social learning likely expanded with each generation that picked up a stone and made it sharper. But we must be careful not to romanticize it. These were not the first artists or philosophers. They were scavengers, opportunists, apes with a new trick. And yet, in that trick was the seed of everything else. A small act of fracture that made the world less random, that turned chance into choice. And the haunting question that lingers is this: what if it hadn't happened? What if the first flake had never flown? What if the mind behind that fracture had walked away instead? Would the world have waited for another 1,000,000 years? Or would the edge have never come at all? What does it mean to be human? It's a question that seems so large, so existential, that we often push it into philosophy or psychology, as if it were too fragile for fossil dust or flakes of ancient stone. But something changed between 2,500,000 and 1,900,000 years ago. Something so slow you might miss it entirely. And yet, when we look back across the strata of East Africa, when we kneel beside the bones and the butchered marks and the suddenly more capable hands, we can begin to feel the contour of a shift. Not a leap, not a revelation, but a becoming. A slow, uneven, partial emergence of a creature that would later give itself a name. Homo. It is tempting to say that Homo habilis was the first of us, but even that title, habilis, the handyman, is a name we gave after the fact. When Louis Leakey and colleagues announced their discovery in the early 1960s, it was not just a fossil, it was a story. The idea that humans had begun not with size or speech, but with craftsmanship. And yet, Homo habilis was not a master craftsman. He, or she, was still a creature of two worlds. With a brain hovering somewhere around 600 to 700 cubic centimetres, larger than any Australopithecus but far from the modern range, habilis was a mosaic of old and new. The face was still projecting, the arms still long and powerful, the gait still awkward at times, but the fingers tell a quieter story, more curved than ours, but with greater precision grip than any of the older Australopiths. The thumb was becoming stronger, the pads at the ends of the fingers more capable of delicate manipulation. The tools found nearby, simple flaked cores and battered flakes, may not have required genius, but they required intent. The Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania remains one of the richest landscapes for these clues. Here, Homo habilis fossils have been found alongside the stone artefacts of the older one tradition. Bones of large mammals, antelopes, zebras, elephants, lie nearby, often with cut marks running across them, sometimes intersecting with tooth marks left by large carnivores. This overlapping evidence has sparked decades of debate. Were these early humans hunters or scavengers, or something more flexible, opportunistic and quietly clever than either word implies? The truth is that meat-eating was not new. Even Australopiths may have dabbled in it. But what changed with habilis, or possibly even slightly earlier, was the regularity, the strategy, and the coordination. Some bones show signs of marrow extraction, suggesting not just passive consumption, but an understanding of sequence, that a long bone could be broken to yield something rich inside. And that richness mattered. Meat is calorically dense and packed with nutrients critical to brain growth. Around this same time, endocranial volume in early Homo begins to increase. Not drastically, not suddenly, but enough to suggest a new kind of biological feedback loop. Better tools led to better access to food, better food supported larger brains allowed for better tools, and so on. It wasn't a spiral towards supremacy, it was a series of tiny adjustments, each one ratcheting upward not toward dominance, but toward complexity. But Homo habilis wasn't alone in this landscape of change. At roughly the same time, another fossil form begins to appear, Homo rudolfensis. First discovered near Lake Turkana in Kenya, rudolfensis is a bit of a mystery. The skull is larger, the face flatter, the teeth broader. Brain size may have reached 700 or even 750 cubic centimetres in some individuals, and yet postcranial remains are scarce, making it hard to say how rudolfensis moved, how it held tools, how it lived. Some paleoanthropologists argue that Rudolfensis and habilis are simply variants of the same lineage, males and females, or regional populations. Others believe they were separate branches of early Homo, coexisting in overlapping territories. Either way, the point remains, this was not the clean ascent of a chosen species. It was an ecological experiment, playing out over centuries and savannas, one slightly larger brain at a time. Kenya's Kubifora region adds further layers to this picture. Here, researchers have uncovered a dense cluster of sites with stone tools, butchered bones, and early Homo fossils. The sediments are well preserved, the dating reliable, the pattern surprisingly consistent. Wherever we find the tools, we find a slightly different kind of presence, less opportunistic than before, more planned. Sometimes clusters of tools appear far from the raw material sources, suggesting transport, and that word, transport, may not seem revelatory, but it hints at something fragile and vast. Foresight. The decision to carry a useful item for use later, in a different place, implies an internal map, a memory of what has been, and a quiet rehearsal of what might come next. Even more subtle is the possible shift in social life. While bones and tools survive, conversations do not. But we can infer. The efficiency of butchery techniques suggests shared knowledge. The presence of multiple individuals at kill or scavenging sites suggests cooperation. And the danger of navigating a predator-rich landscape with only stones and smarts suggests a level of social cohesion we may never fully grasp. Were there proto-language vocalizations? Probably. Were they naming things, planning hunts, or just sharing emotion, fear, excitement, hunger, in a kind of tonal communion? We do not know, and that's the point. Science is not here to fill in the gaps with stories. It is here to hold the space open, to remind us how much of becoming human is still missing. The Rift Valley itself shaped much of this evolution. Tectonic shifts created lakes and exposed sediments. Volcanic ash preserved traces in ways few other regions could. And the patchwork landscape, alternating between grasslands, brush and wooded margins, may have provided the selective pressures necessary for flexibility. In this unstable mosaic, adaptability was survival. The earliest Homo species were not specialists. They were generalists with good hands, decent memory, and a willingness to change. That might be the most human trait of all. By the end of this period, something fundamental had occurred. We were still small, still quiet, still scattered across a few valleys in East Africa. But we had crossed a line we could not uncross, not just anatomically, cognitively, behaviourally. We had begun to shape the world outside our bodies with intention, and once that starts, it doesn't stop. Each flake broken from a cobble, each bone stripped a little cleaner, each memory passed on in gestures, grunts, or silence. This was the real revolution. It just didn't look like one. So what makes a human human enough? Is it a bigger brain, a better grip, the taste for marrow, the cautious sharing of meat beneath a tree while the lions still circle? Maybe it's none of those things alone. Maybe it's the moment a primate breaks a rock and something shifts. Not just in the stone, but in the mind that broke it. Not all at once, not everywhere, but enough to begin the long rehearsal for everything that would follow, and enough perhaps to suggest that becoming human was never about being finished. It was about never being finished at all. How did a creature born in Africa end up walking into Asia? It wasn't destiny. It wasn't even curiosity, at least not in the modern sense. No maps, no plans, no one writing a journal about the adventure. Just feet, walking, slowly, one valley at a time. But sometime between 1,900,000 and 1,200,000 years ago, a species of human emerged that didn't just adapt to its environment, it moved beyond it. And when it did, it became something new. Taller, leaner, quieter, more enduring. This was Homo erectus, and it was the first of our kind to leave the continent where all of us began. Homo erectus appears in the fossil record like a whisper gaining momentum. The earliest remains are found in East Africa, sites like Kubifora in Kenya and Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. These early individuals had something that previous humans did not. Their limbs were longer, more proportioned like ours. The pelvis was narrower, more efficient for upright walking over long distances. The feet, solid and arched, could absorb the shock of step after step. This was not the awkward stride of Australopithecus, or the still limited gait of Homo habilis. This was a skeleton built to travel, not in bursts but in endurance. Homo erectus didn't sprint across continents, it simply didn't stop walking. The brain was larger too, often approaching 900 cubic centimetres in early specimens and eventually growing beyond 1,000. But this wasn't just about thinking, it was about coordination, memory, and response. Moving into new environments meant dealing with change, different animals, different plants, colder nights, thinner air. Homo erectus didn't invent new technology overnight to solve these problems, but it survived them, and survival, across that scale of space and time, is its own kind of genius. One of the most revealing sites is in Georgia, near the small town of Dmanisi. Here, in sediments dated to around 1,800,000 years ago, researchers uncovered a remarkable collection of fossils, not just a skull or two, but nearly complete individuals, 4 or 5 of them, preserved in what was once a stream bed. The Dmanisi hominins had small brains by erectus standards, some as low as 600 cubic centimetres, but they had the same body plan: slender legs, human-like feet, and simple stone tools, not unlike the older one flakes and cores found in Africa. This was no flash of genius, just a steady expansion. The Dmanisi site tells us something profound, that leaving Africa didn't require complexity, it required capacity. The capacity to endure, to adapt, and to keep moving, even when no one had ever gone that way before. From Georgia, the trail extends east, much further east. In northern China, at a site called Nihewan Basin, archaeologists have uncovered stone tools, simple flakes, but unmistakably modified, that date back at least 1,600,000 years. Further south, in Java, Indonesia, Homo erectus fossils appear in layers more than 1,500,000 years old. How did they get there? Likely by island hopping across what we now call Sunderland, a vast stretch of lowland that was at the time exposed by lower sea levels. It wasn't a single journey, it was generations of quiet migration. Rivers followed, game pursued, hills crested and forgotten, and across it all the steady erosion of boundaries. What had once been a local species became a continental one. The tools that travelled with them were still simple, mostly flakes and chopping implements, more older one than anything else. No dramatic breakthroughs, no sudden revolutions, but they worked. And in places like Bose Basin in southern China, hammerstones and anvils have been found alongside butchered animal bones, suggesting that Homo erectus was not merely passing through. It was settling, processing, and perhaps even thriving. Climate helped. The early Pleistocene was a time of fluctuating temperatures, but also of opportunities. As the African Rift Valley shifted, as savannas expanded and contracted, new corridors opened. Grasslands stretched north into the Levant and eastward into Persia and beyond. Forests receded, wooded pockets remained, and into this patchwork stepped a species that could handle both shade and sun. Homo erectus was not a specialist. It was a generalist. It didn't need a single niche. It made do with many. One of the more haunting reminders of this expansion is not a fossil, but a footprint. In northern Kenya, at a place called Illoret, paleontologists found a series of human-like tracks preserved in hardened mud. These are not the splayed tentative prints of early hominins. These are tracks that look, to the untrained eye, like our own. Aligned toes, arched steps, a stride that suggests upright, confident walking. They were left by Homo erectus nearly 1,500,000 years ago, and they show something more than just movement. They show direction. But why? Why leave Africa at all? Not for conquest, not for curiosity in the conscious sense. Most likely the expansion was ecological. As resources shifted, as animals migrated, early humans followed. Water sources changed, plant distributions altered, and the groups that had the ability to keep moving were the ones that survived. It was not a heroic journey, it was a demographic one. Some stayed, some left. Those who left footprints across half the planet. There are still mysteries. Why are some Homo erectus skulls found with so much variability in brain size? Were there multiple regional populations? Is the term erectus even sufficient to describe all the different forms from Java, China, and Central Asia? Some researchers argue for regional subspecies, others propose even deeper splits. But whatever the taxonomic labels, the pattern holds. By 1,200,000 years ago, humans had done something no primate had done before. They had become a global animal. This wasn't a story of progress. There were limits. The tools remained basic for nearly another million years. There is no widespread evidence of shelters or organized hunting. And while social life surely existed, it left few traces we can recognize. But the real revolution had already happened. The world had changed shape, not geologically, but biologically. It now contained humans in motion, not in one ecosystem, not in one form, but across continents, and this raises a deeper question. When Homo erectus walked into Asia, was it still Homo erectus, or had the journey already begun to transform it? Are species boundaries real lines, or just the temporary names we give to things that won't stop changing? Every footfall carried a body and a brain into unfamiliar lands. Every new valley posed a challenge, and every generation born far from the rift carried a slightly different map in its bones. We are often told that humanity began in Africa, and that is true, but just as true is this: humanity began again in Georgia, in China, in Indonesia, not because the species changed, but because the context did. And as the bones of Homo erectus lie scattered from the banks of the Black Sea to the equatorial jungles of Java, they whisper a quiet truth. We are not from one place. We are from many. We are the descendants of a species that once walked into the unknown without knowing it was doing anything remarkable at all. The journey was not about destination. It was about continuation. And maybe that is what it means to be human. To keep moving, even when you don't know what you'll find. To leave the warmth of the familiar and step into landscapes no one has named yet. To walk, not toward glory, but simply because the world is large, and your legs are strong, and the path ahead is still open. Why did a species with no cities, no writing, and no rulers spend over 1 million years shaping rocks into perfect teardrops? The Acheulean hand axe is one of the most persistent objects in the human story, first appearing around 1,800,000 years ago and continuing, remarkably, into the late Middle Pleistocene. These tools are so ubiquitous and consistent that some archaeologists have called them the first true artifact of design. From the banks of the Thames to the open plains of the Rift Valley, from India's Soane Valley to the edges of Iberia, the hand axe is there, pointed, symmetrical, and unmistakably human. And what makes it even stranger is this: it didn't change very much for over 1 million years. To understand the hand axe is to understand a shift in how early humans began interacting with their environment, not just reacting to it, but reshaping it with intention. The Acheulean industry, as it's now called, followed the earlier older one tradition of simple flake tools. But unlike those expedient one-off flakes, Acheulean tools required planning. Shaping a good hand axe isn't just about bashing a rock until something sharp appears. It's about visualizing a shape inside the stone before you even begin. That alone tells us something. Whoever made these tools could hold an idea in their mind, not a vague instinct, but a pattern, and then bring it into being, one strike at a time. The earliest examples of hand axes come from East Africa, especially sites like Kokisele in Kenya and Konso in Ethiopia. At first, these tools were rougher, larger, often ovate or elongated. But over time, a strange thing happened. The shape began to converge. By around 1,200,000 years ago, across multiple regions, we start to see hand axes with a consistent outline, ovate bases tapering to a point, thin bifacial flaking, balanced symmetry. This wasn't random. It looked like tradition. But whose tradition? Most scholars associate the Acheulean with Homo erectus, and in later cases, with other large-brained Homo species across the Old World. Whoever the makers were, they seemed to agree, over immense spans of time and space, that this was the right way to make a tool. And that brings us to one of the more eerie mysteries of this technology. The hand axe spread almost globally, but without innovation. It was perfected, then preserved. Imagine a single design being passed from generation to generation for over 1 million years. In our modern world, where styles shift in weeks and devices become obsolete in months, that kind of continuity feels impossible. Why did it last so long? One theory is simply that it worked. A good hand axe is an incredibly versatile tool. You can butcher a carcass, scrape hides, dig roots, chop wood. You can use it as a knife, a wedge, even a throwing object in desperation. But efficiency alone doesn't fully explain the persistence of form. Some archaeologists suspect the hand axe was more than just a tool. It may have been a teaching object, a way to demonstrate knowledge, a way for one hominin to show another how to think. There's also something almost aesthetic about the best Acheulean hand axes. At sites like Boxgrove in England or Kalambo Falls in Zambia, some tools show a precision that seems unnecessary for mere utility. Perfect bilateral symmetry, smooth surfaces, balanced weight. These weren't just sharp rocks, they were crafted with care. Some have suggested they may have had a social or even sexual signalling role, like peacock feathers in stone. Others think the symmetry was a side effect of better knapping skills. Those who flaked better simply produced more balanced tools. The truth is, we don't know. What we do know is that the design mattered enough to preserve. It also mattered enough to teach. Acheulean tools require skill to produce, and that skill isn't easily invented from scratch. It has to be learned, refined, passed down. This implies some form of teaching behaviour, possibly imitation, perhaps demonstration, maybe even something closer to structured guidance. But again, the evidence is indirect. What we see in the stones is consistency. And consistency over generations means culture. The scale of this cultural transmission is staggering. From Africa, hand axe technology spread north into the Levant and across into Europe. At Cima del Elefante and Atapuerca in Spain, early layers show tools of clear Acheulean origin. In India, sites in the Siwalik Hills preserve thousands of hand axes strewn across ancient floodplains. These tools weren't just scattered, they were everywhere. And while the shapes varied slightly by region and time, the core idea endured. A bifacial tool pointed at one end, grippable at the other, flaked with skill. And yet, despite this sophistication, there's no sign that Acheulean toolmakers crossed a symbolic threshold. There are no carvings, no beads, no decorations, just function, refined over eons. This raises a quiet tension in how we think about early humans. We often equate intelligence with novelty, the constant invention of new forms. But what if the deepest form of intelligence was conservation? The careful keeping of what works, and the humility to not reinvent it unless necessary. Over 1 million years is not a footnote in our species' history. It's most of it. For the vast majority of our time on Earth, we lived in small groups, used stone tools shaped by hand, and passed those techniques through generations without writing, without schools, without monuments. The hand axe may not tell us what these hominins thought, but it tells us that they thought, that they remembered, that they had patience. There's also an elegance to the fact that this object, so basic in form, became the first global design. Before the wheel, before the plough, before the temple or the tablet or the city, there was the hand axe, and not just one. Millions of them, strewn across deserts, forests, riverbanks and caves. A silent language of stone speaking across species and centuries. Eventually, of course, the Acheulean would fade. New technologies would emerge. New species would appear. But for a very long time, that pointed teardrop was the signature of human presence. It's worth asking, how many of our own tools will last 1 million years? How many of our designs are worth preserving not for a season, but for an epoch? The haunting question is not whether the hand axe was the best tool ever made. It's whether it marked the first time a human looked at the world and said, "This shape matters," and then passed that idea on, again and again, until it became not just a habit, but a memory in stone. What happens when an animal brings the sky to the ground? For almost the entire history of life on Earth, fire was something to fear. It came from lightning and volcanoes, from dry leaves and hot winds, from places too powerful to touch. But at some point, perhaps around 1 million years ago, a strange primate stopped running from it, and instead stayed. That moment, when fire ceased to be just danger and became tool, warmth, memory, may be one of the most quietly transformative turning points in the human story. Not an invention, but an allegiance, not a weapon, but a companion. Taming fire wasn't just about survival, it was about control, over time, over energy, and maybe over each other. Let's start with what we think we know. One of the oldest and most debated pieces of evidence for controlled fire use comes from Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa. Inside its ancient sediment layers, Dating back close to 1 million years ago, researchers have found charred bones and burned plant material scattered across what appears to be an intact habitation layer. This matters. Natural fires rarely burn deep inside caves, so if these ashes belong to that time and aren't just later contaminants, then someone somewhere carried fire into the dark. But there's a catch. Burned remains don't always mean fire was made. They only mean it was used. A wildfire could have been harvested. A smouldering branch could have been preserved. For decades, archaeologists have debated the difference between fire presence and fire control. The earliest hearths, structures built to contain and manage flame, don't become widespread until closer to 400,000 years ago. At sites like Beecher's Pit in England or Kesem Cave in Israel, we begin to see ash layers, burned bone concentrations, and even charcoal deposits that suggest repeated use. These weren't just one-off campfires, they were part of the rhythm. Still, the origins go deeper. In fact, even before fire was reliably controlled, it may have been socially valued. Some researchers suggest that fire gathering, the ability to find and protect embers from lightning strikes or forest burns, could have become a specialized role in early groups. Keeping fire alive, without knowing how to start it, might have been one of our first communal responsibilities. A shared dependency. Because when you lose fire in a cold night, you lose more than heat. You lose protection, light, a cooking source, and perhaps even the emotional heart of your group. And cooking, as it turns out, changed everything. Raw meat is hard to digest. Tubers and roots are fibrous and often toxic until heated. But once food is cooked, energy becomes more accessible. Digestion becomes easier. Parasites are reduced. Some anthropologists argue that the adoption of cooking, even sporadic at first, led to major physiological shifts: shorter guts, smaller teeth, larger brains, bodies that adapted to an external stomach. Fire allowed us to outsource digestion, and that freed up energy elsewhere. But food was only part of the story. Fire kept predators at bay. The flicker of flame and scent of smoke may have turned away lions, hyenas, even snakes. It extended daylight, creating time after dark that was safe for gathering, grooming, or simply existing. And in that extra time, something else may have started to happen: storytelling. Not in words necessarily, but in gesture, in rhythm, in the slow, mesmerizing crackle of flame. Many anthropologists suspect that the fire circle was the first classroom, a place where young members of the group absorbed knowledge, watched skills demonstrated, and began to form memories not tied to immediate danger. Of course, we still don't know exactly when our ancestors first made fire themselves. Starting it from scratch is not trivial. Friction methods, like hand drilling or bow drilling, require dry wood, patience, and technique. Percussion methods, using flint and pyrite to spark, depend on the right materials. There are no preserved fire-starting kits from 500,000 years ago, but there are indirect clues. The more often fire appears at sites and the more centralized it becomes, the more likely it was not just harvested but made. Experimental archaeology has tried to fill the gap. By recreating ancient conditions, researchers have shown that certain species of Homo likely had the strength, dexterity, and coordination to produce fire with stone tools and plant tinder. In particular, the ability to strike sparks from iron-rich rocks onto dried grass bundles has been demonstrated with Stone Age materials. The act itself isn't magic, but the leap it represents is. Because once fire is yours, time shifts. You can soften hides, warm infants, roast marrow, harden wooden spear tips, even boil plants for medicine. You can live in colder places, stay out longer at night, sleep deeper, knowing predators are less bold. You can gather, not just for necessity, but for ritual, for warmth, for presence. In a way, fire did not just extend the day, it extended the mind. By 400,000 years ago, this new pattern of living with fire becomes increasingly visible in the archaeological record. At Terre Amata in France, ancient hearths show signs of structured activity. At Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, charred seeds and nutshells suggest deliberate fuel choices. And at Schöningen in Germany, wooden spears found near fire residues point to hunting technology that may have been thermally treated to improve performance. These weren't accidents, they were strategies. But fire, like most of our turning points, was a slow revolution. There was no single moment when the sky came down and stayed. More likely, it came and went for hundreds of thousands of years. It flared, flickered, disappeared, returned. Different groups may have mastered it independently. Others may have watched from the darkness. Even today, in some traditional societies, fire is still a thing that is passed down, not just as flame, but as knowledge, a spark kept alive by teaching. And that's the haunting part. Fire didn't evolve, it didn't plan. But somehow, through luck or stubbornness or quiet genius, our ancestors entered into a partnership with it, one that reshaped our biology, our ecology, our emotions, and our nights. Even now, we build cities of artificial light to mimic the comfort of the hearth. We name stars after gods, build temples of steel, chase energy in fossil flames, all echoes of that first ember. No matter how modern we become, there is still something about fire that draws us in. Not because it is useful, but because it is alive. It moves, breathes, dances, consumes. And in taming it, perhaps we learned the first truth of all technologies, that power must be tended, not just possessed. So the question isn't when we first used fire, it's when we decided to keep it. Not as a lucky strike, but as a way of life. That decision, to preserve the spark, may have been the first time we chose the future over the present. A small act of hope, a silent promise, a memory that flickers still inside the human mind. And maybe that's the real secret. Not the fire itself, but the decision to sit beside it, to watch it, feed it, shape our lives around it. Because once you begin to live with flame, you start making choices differently. You stay in one place a little longer, you return to the same shelter because the ash ring is still there. You dig a little deeper for roots you know will soften in heat. Even if you don't know how to make the fire yet, you know how to carry it. A smouldering log wrapped in damp bark, a coal hidden in dry dung, a glowing bundle held in trembling hands, and over time, the presence of fire isn't just practical, it's expected. The young gather around it without being told. The old lean closer to it on cold mornings. It becomes part of the rhythm. A soft, flickering centre, and in that glow, perhaps for the first time, life feels different. Not just survival, but belonging. A pattern forming in the dark. Because from here on out, our story will be different. The night will never again be fully dark, and every step we take, every new tool, every migration, every memory passed down, will carry the scent of smoke. For most of our deep past, humans were regional whispers, small bands shaped by wind and hunger, moving through landscapes that changed faster than languages could form. But something shifted around 700,000 years ago. A new kind of hominin began appearing across Africa, into Europe, and eventually stretching east into parts of Asia. We call them Homo heidelbergensis, though the name does more to comfort our need for labels than to reflect the full variation of what was happening. This wasn't a single population wearing identical bones. It was a wide, adaptable, experimental creature, one that may have already started imagining shapes before they existed, even if only for a moment. What makes this group so difficult to define is also what makes them extraordinary. From one fossil to the next, you get a flicker of something just on the edge of recognition. A thicker brow ridge, a more modern jaw, a broader body for colder climates, or a more delicate frame that still whispers Africa. Their brain size hovered close to modern ranges, but it wasn't just about volume. It was about what those brains were doing. These hominins didn't just survive, they engineered. At the site of Schöningen in what is now Germany, archaeologists unearthed wooden spears. Straight, balanced, pointed at both ends. They were shaped with care, likely thrown with skill, and dated to over 400,000 years ago. Wood rarely survives the deep past, but here it did, giving us one of the most intimate glimpses into ancient minds we've ever found. These weren't simple sticks. They were weapons made to fly, to strike, to kill from a distance, and with them came a different kind of planning, a sense not just of the immediate hunt, but of preparation, anticipation, and perhaps even teaching. Across sites in Africa and Europe, stone tools from this time begin to show signs of regional identity. Some groups preferred bifacial symmetry, others added bone or antler to their toolkit. In places like Boxgrove in England, we find butchery sites with organised flake debris, hints of communal effort, and bones cracked with methodical precision. In northern Spain, sites like Atapuerca suggest deliberate corpse deposition, though whether ritual or sanitation, we cannot say. And in the Central African basin, tools show tropical adaptations, still sharp, still human, but fitted to a world of rainforest shadows rather than windswept plains. What unites all of these populations is a growing complexity not just in tools but in behaviour. Repeated site use, durable shelters, and possible seasonal return patterns begin to suggest memory. Maybe not language as we know it, but communication rich enough to coordinate hunts, raise offspring, and perhaps mourn the dead in silence. The archaeological record doesn't give us speeches, but it gives us spears, shaped with hands that had stories. And then there's the question of destiny. Because this wide and variable lineage didn't remain as one, in different regions it fractured. Some gave rise to other now extinct hominins. Others may have vanished into the quiet extinction that claims most species, and in a few cases, without knowing what they were becoming, they lit the fuse for what would one day be called human. They were not us, but they were building the scaffold. So what makes a species ready to branch? To turn one lineage into many? Is it the pressure of climate, the isolation of distance, the chaos of survival? Or is it the quiet momentum of change? A series of small choices that accumulate until they're irreversible. Maybe the species didn't plan to split. Maybe it just happened. Maybe it always does. And if you had met one of them, a tall figure on a foggy steppe, spear in hand, teeth stained from root and marrow, would you have seen an ancestor? Or just a stranger who knew how to aim? It's tempting to draw a straight line between them and us, as if Homo heidelbergensis was simply a halfway point on the road to modernity. But nature rarely sketches in clean lines. Evolution, especially human evolution, is not a ladder. It's a tangle of paths, many of which go nowhere. And when we look closely at the fossil record from this time, what we see isn't a single emerging species marching forward. We see a constellation of hominins spread across continents, each facing their own climates, predators, and challenges, each adapting in ways that might make perfect sense to them, but leave us guessing across the ages. The heidelbergensis populations in Africa show traits leaning more modern: lighter skulls, flatter faces, rounded brain cases. Meanwhile, their cousins in Europe often appear more robust, more cold-adapted, with thick brow ridges and wide nasal apertures. Some may have already begun the long physiological adjustment to Ice Age winters, while others stayed in equatorial zones where heat and rainfall demanded very different survival strategies. And in Asia, the few fossils we have suggest yet another variation, one we still don't fully understand. It's possible that some of these eastern groups were not heidelbergensis at all, but descendants of earlier migrations still evolving on their own terms. The further we look, the more the edges blur. Even their tools reflect this diversity. In some areas, hand axes remain dominant, refined and symmetrical with almost obsessive care. In others, simple flake tools persist alongside new composite technologies, hafted points, shaped wooden implements, and perhaps even early adhesives made from plant resins or birch tar. These innovations don't happen all at once or in all places. They emerge slowly, re-emerge, vanish, and evolve again. The archaeological record isn't a timeline, it's a palimpsest. Layers of memory written over, interrupted and sometimes erased entirely. What does seem consistent is the growing capacity for planning beyond the moment. At sites like Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, we find evidence of repeated fire use and possible food processing areas, including clusters of burnt plant remains. At Terra Amata in southern France, what may be post holes suggest structures built to shelter from wind and rain. These are traces not just of reaction, but of foresight, temporary homes, managed landscapes, social space, and always that sense of cooperation. Homo heidelbergensis was big. Many individuals stood over 6 feet tall and had powerful builds, particularly in colder regions. Their size hints at high-calorie demands, especially in seasonal environments where food availability would fluctuate dramatically. Meeting those needs almost certainly required coordinated hunting. Not just opportunistic scavenging, but the ability to track, ambush, and divide labour. The kind of planning that rewards trust and punishes betrayal. We cannot know how they spoke, if they did, but we can feel the presence of shared knowledge in the way their tools repeat and evolve. A child learning to shape a core in the shadow of a parent. A technique passed from one valley to another, carried not by mutation, but by memory. culture in its quiet, slow-brewing form. And maybe this is why Homo heidelbergensis matters so much. Not because they were the first to think, or the first to speak, or the first to bury or build, but because they stood at the edge of a precipice, holding in their bodies the potential to become something else entirely. In them, we see the moment when humanity became plural, not a single species, but many. Not one future, but several, radiating outward like sparks from a fire that no one yet knew how to light. They were a threshold species, and they didn't know it, which makes you wonder, what thresholds are we standing on now, completely unaware? What happens when humans get trapped with time? Not stranded for days or seasons, but for millennia. Not isolated by accident, but by oceans. It turns out the rules of biology do not care who you are. When a species enters an island, it begins to change. This is not myth. It is not theory. It is math. Large animals tend to get smaller. Small animals tend to get larger. Food is limited. Predators are few. Generations pass. And slowly, something strange happens. Your body forgets the mainland. Evolution trims the edges. Limbs shorten. Brains shift. The island rewrites the blueprint. And in a few thousand years, you're something new. Not broken. Not less. Just smaller. Stranger. Singular. Somewhere between 1 million and 50,000 years ago, this happened to us. Or at least to some of us. The discovery came from a cave on the island of Flores in Indonesia, buried beneath layers of ash and time. It was the year 2003 when researchers uncovered a nearly complete hominin skeleton. She was small, barely 1 meter tall. Her skull was unlike anything seen before, and yet it was human, a different kind of human. She would come to be known as LB1, or more famously the Hobbit. This was not just a short Homo erectus. This was a separate branch, an evolutionary experiment hidden from the world. The remains were found at Liangbua Cave, a cool, protected chamber carved into the volcanic highlands. Inside were stone tools, animal bones, and signs of long-term use. Some of the tools were surprisingly advanced. Small, sharp, flaked stones used for cutting or shaping. But the surprise was not just the tools, it was who had made them. Homo floresiensis had a brain size of around 400 cubic centimeters, smaller than a chimpanzee's, and yet they made tools, butchered animals, and likely hunted the local pygmy stegodon, a dwarf elephant species also sculpted by island evolution. They may have even controlled fire. We do not know for certain. But whatever they were doing it for a very long time. Fossils and tools suggest they may have lived on Flores for hundreds of thousands of years, possibly even coexisting briefly with Homo sapiens before vanishing into the quiet of extinction. To the north, another island held another secret. In the Philippines, deep inside Callao Cave on the island of Luzon, a few small teeth and bone fragments were found in 2007. At first, they seemed too fragmentary to tell much, but as more material emerged, a pattern appeared. These remains, dated to at least 67,000 years ago, belonged to yet another species, Homo luzonensis. Like the Flores hominins, they were small, unique, and unlike anything found on the mainland. Their molars were unusually small, their finger bones curved like those of tree dwellers, and their anatomy seemed to blend primitive and advanced traits in strange mosaic ways. Homo luzonensis may have descended from early Homo erectus migrants who became isolated on Luzon, or they may reflect a more ancient lineage entirely. Either way, they represent yet another forgotten experiment, a human species that adapted in complete ecological isolation, in a world that shaped them like coral shaped by the current. And this is where the island rule becomes more than biology, it becomes philosophical. These were humans who evolved differently not because of divine spark or advanced cognition, but because of where they ended up. Their story was not driven by conquest or invention, but by geography, by the quiet, indifferent role of tectonic plates and sea levels. They were not reaching for the stars, they were surviving inside a boundary they could not escape. Even more humbling is how little brain size seems to have mattered. For centuries we assumed cognition scaled with volume, that a small brain meant a small mind. But the tools of Flores, and the dexterity implied in the Luzon fossils suggest otherwise. These humans, if we still use that word, were doing things we once thought required a certain cranial threshold. But maybe it was never about brain size. Maybe it was about time, about culture, about copying and learning and adapting in a feedback loop that does not require genius, only patience. And if that's true, then what else have we missed? What other humans slipped through the cracks of our assumptions, their bones dissolved or undiscovered beneath a jungle floor or a coral reef shelf? How many stories ended without a witness, without a fossil? We name species from molars and toe bones, but entire civilizations may have flickered and vanished without leaving a single stone tool in reach of our shovels. Today, Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis are both extinct. No one knows exactly when or why they disappeared. Rising seas may have cut them off further. Disease or volcanic eruptions may have ended them. Or perhaps contact with a more invasive cousin, Homo sapiens, led to their quiet erasure. But the truth is, we do not know. And in that not knowing, we are reminded again that this story is still being written. Because if humans could evolve on Flores and Luzon, and perhaps other islands we have not yet dug deep enough to reach, then we must ask, how many versions of us were there? How many experiments did evolution run in parallel before leaving only one survivor? And in the silence of those empty caves, among the layers of ash and pygmy bones, the question still lingers. If they were human enough to make tools, to hunt, to gather, to maybe speak, were they also human enough to wonder what came before them? Did they ever look to the ocean and dream of where they had come from? We will probably never know. But maybe that's the point. That not all stories leave echoes. Some humans were simply brief, beautiful, and lost to time. Did Neanderthals have a soul? It's the kind of question that sounds poetic, maybe even a little dramatic. But somewhere beneath the sentiment is a real scientific challenge. Because if by soul we mean the ability to symbolize, to grieve, to imagine something not physically present, then the search becomes archaeological. It becomes about pigments, patterns, and quiet arrangements in the dark. And between 400,000 and 40,000 years ago, there was a species in Europe, the Near East, and parts of Asia that seems to have been doing exactly that. Their bones were thick, their brows were heavy, their tools were flaked by practiced hands, and somewhere along the way, something strange began to appear in the archaeological record. Not just survival, but symbol. For much of the 20th century, Neanderthals were portrayed as dull, a sideline in the human story, stocky, slow, without the spark of modern cognition. But the evidence did not care about the bias. It kept showing up anyway. At La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, a Neanderthal body was found carefully positioned in a shallow grave. Its flexed limbs, missing predator marks, and associated stone tools suggested intentional burial. Not just disposal, but attention. Later discoveries at sites like Shanidar in Iraqi Kurdistan reinforced the idea. One skeleton, Shanidar 4, was found with pollen grains from colourful flowers embedded in the sediment, leading some to argue for a ritual or memorial act. Though the flower interpretation remains debated, the care in the burial itself has not been so easily dismissed, and burials were only the beginning. In multiple Neanderthal sites across Europe, researchers began to find traces of pigment. Not smeared randomly, but collected, stored, and sometimes applied to surfaces or to bodies. Red ochre, rich in iron, appears again and again. Sometimes it was scraped into powder, sometimes it was stored in shells or lumps. In one case at Cueva de los Aviones in Spain, Neanderthal-made perforated shells contained pigment mixtures. Some even show wear patterns consistent with being strung together, possibly as beads, not tools, not food, decoration, symbol. Even bones became a canvas. At Grotte du Rhin, a site in France dated to around 50,000 years ago, researchers found an assemblage of Neanderthal tools alongside personal ornaments, pierced animal teeth, ivory rings and grooved bones. Though some debate still surrounds the context of these finds, the possibility remains that Neanderthal were engaging in behaviours long considered exclusive to Homo sapiens. And it gets weirder. In a deep cave system at Bruniquel in southern France, nearly 400 broken stalagmites were found arranged into deliberate circular structures more than 300 metres from the entrance. They were burned, organised, old. Uranium dating placed them at over 175,000 years ago, and they were made by Neanderthals. There are no signs of habitation, no bones, no tools, just these rings of stone lit by fire in a place with no natural light. If this was not symbolic, then it was something close. A structure built for no physical purpose. Something else was happening, and that something else points us toward a mind we don't fully understand. Neanderthals were anatomically distinct from us. Broader pelvises, shorter limbs, robust bones adapted to Ice Age climates, but their brains were large. In some cases, even larger than those of modern humans. The shape was different, perhaps more weighted toward visual and spatial processing, but not lacking in complexity. Their stone tools, often referred to as the Mousterian tradition, included refined flake production, levallois techniques, and evidence of hafted spear points. They knew how to plan, to craft, and to return to useful quarries across years. But again, this was still about survival. The deeper question is whether Neanderthals had culture, not just tradition or utility, but shared mental models passed down, expanded, or refined. And in some ways, we can only guess. Bone does not preserve a campfire story. Stone does not fossilize a lullaby, but every shell bead, every ochre-stained grave, every hidden structure in the dark hints at something more than instinct. Something slow, intentional, maybe even sacred. In El Cedron, a cave in Spain, the bones of 12 Neanderthals, 3 adult males, 3 adult females, 3 adolescents and 3 children, were found together. Genetic testing revealed they were related. One extended family group. Their teeth showed signs of diet variation. Their bones bore cut marks. They had been butchered, likely during a period of extreme scarcity. Cannibalism is not symbolic. It is survival at its most brutal. But even in that act, something human pulses. Because survival isn't always beautiful. Sometimes culture includes desperation. But then there's another site, Cueva de Ardales in southern Spain, where a stalagmite dome deep within the cave was deliberately painted with red pigment. The paint appears to have been applied more than 65,000 years ago, long before any known Homo sapiens arrived in the region, which means the artist, if that's the word, was Neanderthal. The pigment wasn't smeared once. It was refreshed, possibly over thousands of years. A tradition? A memory? We don't know. But the choice to return and remark the same space suggests significance. And this is what unsettles the old narratives, because it's not just one site, it's dozens. Over and over again the pattern holds. Careful burial, pigment use, ornamentation, possible structures. None of these individually prove a symbolic mind, but together they form a shape, a blurry, shifting outline of a creature who did not just survive but thought, remembered, decorated, perhaps even mourned. Of course, caution matters. The line between function and symbol is thin. Red ochre might be used for hide preservation. Shells could be collected for their utility. But there's a difference between collecting and curating, between scattering pigment and applying it to a corpse. And that difference is where the soul, or at least the symbolic mind, might live. Today, when we picture Neanderthals, we're slowly beginning to correct the bias. The heavy brow remains. But behind it, we now see a mind full of ambiguity. A species not quite like us, but also not entirely different. They lived in small bands. They braved glacial winters. They made tools. They buried their dead. And in the flicker of firelight, they may have told stories no one now remembers. So did they have a soul? We can't answer that. But they had symbols. They had silence. They had places they returned to. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the story they left us is not one of primitive survival, but of parallel depth. A separate lineage of thought, emotion, and expression that simply took a different path. And that's what makes their disappearance so haunting. Not just that they're gone, but that we never got to hear their version of the world. That somewhere out there, in a cave now collapsed or flooded, there might be the final piece, the last carved bone, the last ochre spiral, waiting to remind us that humanity was never just one shape. It was always many. Some of them are still buried in the dark. What does the beginning of us really look like? Not the US of cities and stories, but the quiet beginning. The biological shift that slowly shaped our bones, brains and faces into something recognisably modern. If you were standing in Africa around 300,000 years ago, you might have missed it entirely. There was no flag in the dirt, no new tool revolution, no dramatic leap in behaviour, just a few scattered populations of hominins, walking the same plains, using the same flakes, facing the same challenges. But in their bones, something different was starting to take hold. A change not in how they lived, but in who they were. For much of the last century, paleoanthropology held onto a tidy story, that Homo sapiens emerged fully formed in East Africa, perhaps around 200,000 years ago, descended from a small founding population. That model still echoes in textbooks, but the fossils did not always agree. In the Moroccan desert near a place called Jebel Erhoud, archaeologists uncovered a set of remains that didn't fit the script. A partial skull, some jaw fragments, tools, burnt flint. At first, the site was thought to be maybe 40,000 years old. Then, with new thermoluminescence dating of the flint, the age was pushed back dramatically. The layers were nearly 315,000 years old. And the bones, they looked familiar. Not entirely modern, but close. The brow ridge was strong, the face tucked in. The brain case, though, was elongated, more archaic. Still, the features sat within the expected range of early Homo sapiens, which meant that the story of us needed to begin earlier, and not just earlier, broader. Because Jebel Erhoud is in northwest Africa, far from the rift valleys traditionally seen as our cradle. A similar challenge emerged from Omo Kibish, a site near the Omo River in Ethiopia. There, a skull known as Omo I was found within layers of volcanic ash. For years, its age hovered around 195,000 years. But a 2022 reassessment of the underlying ash linked to a known eruption of the Shala volcano pushed the minimum date back. The skull had to be at least 233,000 years old, possibly more, and once again the bones matched. A chin, a rounded skull, the face of a species on the edge of becoming us. But the change wasn't sudden. Homo sapiens didn't spring into being in a single location, with a single mutation. The evidence now suggests a more complex model, what researchers are calling a Pan-African origin. Rather than one birthplace, the features we consider modern emerged gradually across widely scattered populations. From South Africa to the Sahel to the Red Sea coast, regional groups with shared ancestry exchanged genes, tools, and adaptations over hundreds of thousands of years. Slowly, the anatomical mosaic began to settle. One of the key transitions was in brain shape, not just size. Our ancestors already had brains as large as ours, but the structure shifted. In earlier hominins like Homo heidelbergensis or Neanderthals, the brain case was long and low. Over time, in Homo sapiens, it became more globular, rounded, with a reorganization of internal architecture that may have influenced cognition, memory, and social behavior. The cause is still debated. It may have been linked to early childhood development, or changes in face shape and base of skull. But whatever triggered it, globularization marks a turning point. A head now sculpted to hold a different kind of mind. The skeletal changes too were subtle but meaningful. A flatter face, smaller teeth, a more delicate jaw. The shift in pelvis shape, limb proportions and even foot arch. All of it reflecting a long, slow adaptation to a new kind of movement, metabolism, and birth pattern. These weren't just cosmetic differences. They were signs of a lineage that was narrowing in on something specific. A biological platform for what would one day become the cultural explosion we now call human. But that explosion had not yet happened. Between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens still lived in small mobile bands. They hunted, gathered, and scavenged. They made stone tools that, to the untrained eye, looked nearly identical to what their ancestors had used. They left behind footprints, hearths, and refuse heaps. What they did not leave, yet, were clear signs of art, symbols, or narrative memory. And that's important, because it reminds us that anatomy and behavior don't always evolve in sync. A fully modern skeleton does not guarantee a fully modern mind. Nor does a large brain mean the presence of language or story. The earliest Homo sapiens may have looked like us, but they probably didn't think like us, or at least not in the ways we now expect. Their world was still rooted in the immediate: survival, reproduction, seasonal movement. Whatever complexity lived in their minds, it was not yet preserved in pigment or stone, and still they endured. Across shifting climates, arid phases, and resource booms and busts, they adapted. Fossil evidence from places like Herto in Ethiopia, dated to around 160,000 years ago, shows individuals with strong modern features and signs of butchery and tool use. In southern Africa, skulls like those from Florisbad or Border Cave add to the morphological range. and the geographic spread. The puzzle is messy, but that's science, and maybe that's what defines this moment most clearly. Not a triumphant debut, but a quiet birth, a scattered lineage, coexisting with other humans not yet dominant, not yet global, just present, walking, learning, changing, piece by piece. And this makes the haunting question even sharper. What would it have felt like to be them? To live in a body so close to modern, but in a world without storybooks, carvings, or songs? Was the self already there? Did they name the stars, or just follow them? We don't know. But their bones whisper that something was beginning. Not a revolution, a long, slow ignition, a species becoming itself, one quiet birth at a time. Why did our ancestors paint with iron before they even had a map? Before cities, before alphabets, before even leaving the continent of their birth, they were already colouring the walls of caves with red earth, engraving crosshatches into bone and stone, and stringing shells into beads they likely never ate. Somewhere between 200,000 and 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began to do something strange and unnecessary. We began to symbolise, and we did it long before there was any audience but ourselves. If you follow the southern coastline of Africa, near the southern tip of what is now Cape Town, you'll come to a sandstone cliff that hides a cave. Blombos. At first glance, it's a shallow cavity, open to the wind and sea. But inside, under layers of sand and sediment, archaeologists found a whisper of something startling. Blocks of ochre, rubbed smooth by use, some carved with deliberate repeated patterns, crisscrossing lines etched into the soft iron-rich mineral. The dates? Around 75,000 years ago, maybe more. This is not the first place ochre appears, nor the last. But Blombos is one of the clearest. It gives us not only pigment but pattern, not only colour but context. Because buried nearby were perforated shells, tiny nacarius beads, worn smooth and likely strung on a cord. No evidence of a meal, just ornaments, decoration. The shells had been collected and altered. Some may have been carried from sites dozens of kilometres away, which tells us the action was purposeful. The intention was not utility, it was meaning. In another part of the cave, archaeologists uncovered a small slab of stone engraved with a geometric motif, a grid of lines carefully etched into the surface. Again, no direct function. No way to argue it was a cutting board or tool. It was simply marked, possibly with memory, possibly with identity, but undeniably marked by a mind that had moved beyond the moment. And perhaps the most striking find was not the red pigment or the beads, but the workshop. Tucked beneath layers dated to around 100,000 years ago was a small abalone shell used to mix and store ochre. Next to it, a bone spatula used for stirring, bits of charcoal, hammerstones, an actual kit, a paint box. And here, the leap is inescapable. Our ancestors were not just collecting ochre, but processing it, grinding, heating, mixing, storing, not randomly, systematically, over time, with memory, with recipes. This, in many ways, is harder to grasp than any cave painting. A painting might be spontaneous, but a kit implies repetition, a way of doing something again, a tradition, a teacher, a student, a culture. Across southern Africa, similar signs began to emerge. At Pinnacle Point, red ochre appears in layers going back over 160,000 years. At Sibadu Cave, evidence of compound adhesives, made from ochre, plant resin, and other materials, suggests the production of hafted tools combining stone points with wooden shafts. That too is a kind of symbolism, not visual but cognitive, the ability to bind different materials into a unified object, with a purpose beyond the immediate. But the symbolism wasn't just technical. At sites like Border Cave, we see decorated snail shells, more ochre-stained tools, and even traces of bedding layered with aromatic plants, perhaps for comfort, perhaps for insects, but always layered, arranged, chosen. And behind all of it, the red thread continues, because ochre is not just a colour, it is a signal, a substance that binds across cultures and time, rich in iron, ubiquitous in the soil, unnecessary for survival but chosen by nearly every group of humans, across continents, across millennia. From the earliest Homo sapiens in Africa, to Aboriginal body paint, to burial rites in Ice Age Europe. Ochre is the one thing we keep returning to, long before we understood chemistry or had names for blood and rust. And what does that say about us? That the impulse to mark, to colour, to leave a sign is not the end point of civilization, but its beginning? That we made the leap into symbolism not with cities, but with scratches on stone and streaks of red clay smeared on skin? What drove it? Was it memory? Status? Religion? The truth is we don't know. The patterns are consistent, the pigments are real, but the meanings are long lost. There are no cave-side instruction manuals, just layers of ash, pigment and shells, whispering a story we're still trying to translate. And maybe it wasn't a single meaning at all. Maybe it was just practice, the slow accumulation of behaviours that, taken together, hinted at something more. A growing capacity for abstraction, a sense that the world was more than meat and danger, that there were patterns, echoes, identities to shape and share. This was before we spread across the globe, before the ice withdrew and the oceans parted, but already, in southern Africa, the seeds of the symbolic mind had taken root, not in a single genius, but in the quiet repetition of small, unnecessary acts. A line scratched into ochre, a shell worn around the neck, a pigment ground and stored for tomorrow. And so we return to the haunting question, why did they do it? Why did early humans, long before maps or myths, feel the need to mark their world in red? Was it beauty? Was it belief? Or was it something simpler, something older? The first quiet murmur of a species beginning to see itself. Whatever the answer, it left a trace. And that trace runs through us still. From the walls of Blombos to the fingertips of every child who draws without needing to, the red thread continues. What did the earth feel like when we stepped into it? Alone. Not empty in the modern sense. Not barren or bleak, but untouched by us. No footprints in the sand, no smoke on the horizon, no other sapiens. Just open sky, unfamiliar stars, and a horizon that stretched forever. Between 100,000 and 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, already anatomically human, already carrying ochre and beads and hafted stone, took their first careful steps beyond the African homeland that had shaped their entire species, and the world beyond had no idea what was coming. The first hints are subtle, a few teeth in a cave, a flake of stone in sediment. These are not armies or empires. They are scouts, small groups, families perhaps, moving along rivers, tracing coastlines, chasing game, escaping drought, or simply looking for something new. For decades, the story of human migration was simple. A single exodus. A clean sweep out of East Africa into the Levant around 60,000 years ago, replacing everyone along the way. But now, the evidence resists simplicity. Fossils from the Mislia cave in Israel, a maxilla, part of an upper jaw, suggest Homo sapiens may have been present in the Levant as early as 170,000 years ago. Other fragments from Apidema in Greece, possibly even older. These were not mass migrations, but pulses, failed expansions, or successful ones that left no descendants. What matters is that they show the pattern had begun, the urge to explore, to leave, to test the unknown. By around 70,000 years ago, the most successful and lasting migration began. Genetic evidence points to a single population, a subset of Homo sapiens in East Africa, that expanded and gave rise to all non-African humans alive today. This expansion was not a tidal wave, it was a trickle. Small bands, maybe only a few dozen individuals at a time, moving along the southern coast of Arabia, hugging shorelines, exploiting shellfish, mangroves and estuaries. Not inland conquest, coastal wandering. The so-called southern dispersal route is supported by both archaeology and environment. Around this time, sea levels were lower, exposing land bridges and shortening ocean crossings. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, now over 20 kilometres wide, may have been reduced to a manageable crossing. Once in Arabia, the path eastward was dotted with oases, freshwater sources, and an abundance of coastal resources. The oldest unambiguous signs of Homo sapiens outside Africa and the Levant appear in Southeast Asia and Australia. Sites like Lake Mungo, Majed Bebe, and others in northern Australia suggest human presence as early as 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Which means that by the time Europe would first see Homo sapiens, humans had already reached the other end of the world. Getting to Australia was not trivial. It required crossing Wallacea, a biogeographic zone of deep ocean trenches and island arcs that were never connected to the mainland, even during the lowest sea levels. This means that early humans had to build watercraft capable of open sea travel. Maybe not large boats, but rafts, dugouts, something. Enough to carry a group, possibly with children, across treacherous waters filled with saltwater crocodiles, swift currents, and no guarantee of landfall. And yet they did it. Not once, but many times. Australia was not settled in a single leap. It required multiple crossings, possibly over generations through what are now Indonesia and Timor. Along the way, Homo sapiens encountered a world like none they had known. Giant lizards, towering birds, marsupials unlike anything in Africa, diprotodons the size of a car, megafauna that had never seen humans before. This matters. Because for the first time, humans entered ecosystems that had evolved in isolation, and their arrival would have consequences. Though we avoid the extinction question here, it's enough to note that wherever early humans arrived, Australia, the Americas, remote islands, the large animals did not fare well, and this moment marks the beginning of that pattern. A species with fire, tools, social complexity and endurance, meeting animals with no evolved fear of them. But before the consequences came, the awe. Imagine what it was like to step onto a new continent, to hear calls in the trees that had no names, to see tracks in the mud you had no stories for, to walk into landscapes that your ancestors had never imagined, and to realize that no one else was there. No smoke, no drums, no rivals, just land, waiting. In the archaeological record we find scattered clues, charred shells, stone flakes, ochre. It's not grand, but it's persistent. It tells us that humans not only reached these places but stayed, lived, adapted, flourished, in arid coasts, humid jungles and dry savannas, across climates and latitudes. Homo sapiens were no longer just a species. They were a pattern, a force. This period, from 100,000 to 60,000 years ago, is sometimes overshadowed by what came next. The artwork, the burials, the interbreeding. But this was the quiet revolution, the expansion that made all the others possible, and it did not happen with conquest. It happened with footsteps, with patience, with curiosity. And so the question remains, what did it feel like? To leave behind the lands your kind had always known, to cross rivers with no name, to bring ochre and beads to a place where the red dirt was different and the animals were strangers? We cannot know. But the silence they stepped into was not a void. It was a canvas, and they carried with them the colours, and they were not done walking. What kind of animal teaches itself to sow and to dream? Somewhere between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago, a strange kind of memory began to appear on the walls of caves. Not written memory, not yet, but something else, something closer to feeling. A bison in motion, a spiral of red dots, a handprint blown in pigment left by someone with a crooked finger. These were not the marks of accident. They were deliberate, precise, and placed where no wind or rain could reach them. They weren't decorations, they were decisions, and they changed the shape of what a human mind could hold. This wasn't the beginning of art. That moment likely came earlier, in Africa, with engravings, beads, and ochre long before any of our ancestors reached Europe. But this was something else. This was the world turned into symbol, and it started quietly, in the dark. In the Ardèche region of what is now southern France, a collapse sealed off the entrance to a limestone cave. Behind it, preserved for tens of thousands of years, was a gallery of life. Lions with tense shoulders and flared nostrils. Horses galloping in herds, some drawn with more than one head to suggest movement. Owls, mammoths, woolly rhinos, species no longer seen together anywhere on Earth. And in the flicker of torchlight, these animals still seemed to move. The walls of Chauvet Cave had become a theatre of memory. Radiocarbon dating places many of the images to around 35,000 years ago, though some may be older still. The people who made them weren't recording an event. They were expressing something more durable, a way of seeing, a way of marking time without numbers. And they weren't alone. Across the world, in a limestone cave called Langtadonge, on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, a pig was painted in deep red pigment. It stands upright, its body broad, tusks curling outward, one foot lifted in motion. The hand stencils around it suggest a kind of framing, a human presence, not shown, but felt. Dated to at least 45,000 years ago, it is one of the oldest known figurative paintings on Earth, and it is not isolated. Across Sulawesi and Borneo, across Spain and the Pyrenees, across the steppe, and into the hearts of mountains, we see the same thing. Human beings crawling into darkness to leave behind something. Not for gods, not for strangers, for memory. At the same time these images were appearing, another technology was emerging, one equally transformative and just as easy to overlook. The needle. Not a crude thorn or sharpened twig, but a true bone needle, often with a polished eye for threading sinew or plant fibre. These tools appear around 35,000 years ago, and they weren't just for patching hides. They allowed something radically new, tailored clothing. In places where winter meant death, this mattered. Loose wraps and pelts could keep you warm, but stitched garments could trap heat, repel moisture, and free up your hands for hunting and gathering. The needle was a survival tool, but it was also a form of care, one that required planning, skill, and an understanding of the human body as something worth protecting. These two innovations, the cave image and the sewn garment, as may seem unrelated. One is expressive, the other practical. One lives underground, the other moves through the cold above. But both reflect the same growing capacity, abstraction, the ability to see the world not just as it is, but as it could be. A lion on a cave wall, a thread through a bone eye, a vision made real through effort. And both suggest something else too, something that doesn't preserve in stone or pigment, a shared attention. Someone had to teach the young how to draw those animals, how to see them not as prey but as forms. Someone had to show a child how to push sinew through a loop, how to tension a stitch, how to make sleeves. These were not instincts, they were traditions, and they took time. Across Eurasia, this explosion of creative and technical activity left behind an archaeological record that feels almost unfairly dense. In the Czech Republic, ivory Venus figurines with exaggerated bodies suggest symbolic representations of fertility or status. In Germany, flutes made from bird bone and mammoth ivory carry melodic potential, literal instruments of emotional expression. In Siberia, beads, carvings, and pierced animal teeth were threaded into garments, worn on the body and buried with care. None of this was survival in the narrowest sense, but all of it was about surviving as something more than just a body, and they were not done walking. And this, maybe more than anything, is where the modern human begins to feel familiar. Not in the shape of the skull or the curve of the foot, but in the patterns we start to leave behind. The desire to represent, to decorate, to carry meaning, to wear memory on the chest, to scratch marks into antler, to leave behind something that whispers, "I was here." It's easy to overinterpret these finds, to imagine religion, myth, or ritual where we may simply be seeing craft. But it's also hard to ignore the density of pattern. When the same pigments appear across continents, when the same types of personal ornaments show up in distant groups with no direct contact, we start to glimpse something that isn't just local ingenuity, a cultural transmission, ideas that spread, techniques that endured, minds that remembered. And yet, even with all this evidence, there is still so much we cannot know. Who made the first figurine? What did the red ochre spiral mean? Did a child draw those scratched lines, or a leader? Were these images part of storytelling, or were they something more solitary, a form of reflection, or even mourning? We cannot say, but we can look at them and feel something stir, because the story of the Stone Age is not just a story of tools, it is a story of symbols, and symbols are strange. They ask us to see beyond the immediate, to connect things that aren't physically joined, to believe for a moment that a handprint in a cave can outlive the hand itself. That may be what separates us from every other creature that has ever lived. Not language, not fire, but memory. The need to turn experience into something that stays. A mark, a thread, a rhythm played on a bone flute long after the mouth that made it is gone. And when we look at those caves, those needles, those beads and flutes and carvings, we are not just seeing the origin of art or fashion. We are seeing the birth of a new kind of time, one where the past can be carried, one where the invisible becomes real. So what kind of animal teaches itself to sew and to dream? The kind that we'll eventually remember. How many kinds of human do you think have walked this earth? 5, 10, 20? The real answer is, we don't know. And that's not a poetic shrug. It's the honest state of science. We have found just enough bones to prove that most of them are missing, enough DNA fragments to say with confidence that we are not alone in our blood, and enough ancient genes in our cells to whisper that long after the last bones crumbled, their legacy remains. Quiet, invisible, but undeniable. By 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was not the only human on the planet, not by a long shot. Across the mountains of Central Asia, into the caves of Siberia, and in the deep history of island Southeast Asia, there were others. Some we know by fossil, some we know only by ghost. Start with the Denisovans. We never found a Denisovan skeleton. Not one complete body, no skull to reconstruct, no full limb to place in a museum case. Instead, we found a pinky bone. That's it. A small fragment of a girl's finger in the Denisova cave of Siberia, dated to more than 40,000 years ago. It didn't look like much at first, until scientists pulled DNA from it and realized they had stumbled upon a whole new kind of human. Not Neanderthal, not Sapiens, something else, something genetically distinct and genetically real. And then came the molars, giant thick-crowned teeth from the same cave, again unrelated to Neanderthals or us, but matching the girl's DNA. This population, whoever they were, had lived in Denisova Cave for tens of thousands of years, possibly longer. They had their own history, their own adaptations, their own version of being human, and they were not confined to Siberia. Their genetic signature shows up in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. It's present in Tibetans and Melanesians, in Aboriginal Australians, and in the people of the Philippines and parts of Indonesia. Some populations today carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA, and that DNA isn't just some meaningless relic. One of its contributions is the EPAS1 gene, a trait that helps regulate oxygen use at high altitudes. Modern Tibetans inherited it from Denisovans, allowing them to survive in thin air where others could not. So there was contact, there was mixing, but here's where it gets weirder. When scientists dug deeper into the Denisovan DNA in modern populations, they found that not all of it came from the same group. The genes found in the Philippines look different from the ones found in the Himalayas, different enough to suggest that there may not have been one group of Denisovans, but several, separated by geography, adapted to different regions and diverging for hundreds of thousands of years. That's when the idea of ghost populations started to take hold. A ghost population is exactly what it sounds like. A group of humans or near humans who must have existed, because we carry parts of them, but whose bones, tools and faces have never been found. Their only evidence is in the seams of our DNA, like fingerprints in wet ash. You know someone touched it, but the hand is gone. We now believe there were at least 2 major Denisovan lineages, possibly more, and that one of them interbred with us somewhere in Southeast Asia. That makes sense, because fossil evidence has been trickling in from the islands, strange finds that don't fit neatly into any known species. The molars from Callao Cove in Luzon, the small-bodied hominin from Liangboa in Flores, the scattered clues from Sulawesi. Maybe some of these were Denisovans. Maybe they were something else entirely. Maybe they are the ghosts themselves. But Denisovans aren't the only whispers in the genome. In West Africa, genetic studies have identified a mystery lineage, something close to Homo sapiens but not the same, that contributed up to 19% of the DNA in some present-day populations. And yet, we have no fossil to match it, no cave, no site, no name, just a signal. A ghost. This hidden diversity is slowly reshaping how we think about the Stone Age. For a long time, we imagined a world where humans moved out of Africa and gradually replaced everyone else. A clean, simple sweep. But the more we look, the messier it gets. The more ancient DNA we pull from teeth, bones and sediments, the more clear it becomes. We didn't just replace the others, we absorbed them, we mixed with them, we met them, and, at least some of the time, didn't kill them. We made children with them, and those children made more. The Denisovan girl from Siberia wasn't even fully Denisovan. Her mother was Denisovan. Her father was half Neanderthal. That makes her a hybrid of a hybrid. a genetic echo of two lineages meeting in the twilight of their species. She had brown eyes, dark hair, and dark skin, and if you met her in the mountains, you might not know what kind of human she was. But her DNA would. It would tell the story of a planet that wasn't empty, but full. We used to think there was a straight line from the past to us. Now we know it was a braid, and some of the strands are missing, some never fossilized, some were lost to time, but their genes remain, in our immune systems, in our metabolisms, in our memories. Sometimes literally, in the patterns of brain receptors shaped by ancient combinations of genes, in the way our skin responds to light, in the way our bodies handle sugar or altitude or cold. And perhaps the most haunting part is this. For every ghost population we've detected, there are likely more. The limits of ancient DNA mean we can only find what we already suspect. Only extract where preservation is kind. But the Stone Age was big, and most of it we still haven't seen. Somewhere out there, buried under forest or ice or sea, are the bones of humans who never made it into our textbooks, who spoke languages we will never hear, who looked up at the stars and wondered things we will never translate. But they were real. They were here, and some part of them still is. So maybe the question isn't how many kinds of humans there were. Maybe the question is, how many are left in us? The cold did not arrive all at once. It crept in over millennia, like a slow tightening of the planet's breath. By 30,000 years ago, much of Earth had become a locked chamber of wind and snow. Massive ice sheets carpeted the northern latitudes of Eurasia and North America, burying what are now cities, forests and farms beneath kilometres of crushing white. But not everything froze. In the shadows of glaciers and the margins of mountain chains, small refuges remained, places where life and humans could still find a foothold. These ice-free corridors or refugia were never warm in any modern sense, but they were just livable enough, and that was all it took. The humans who endured here were not adapted in the way polar bears or woolly mammoths were. They didn't grow thicker fur or hibernate through the storms. Instead, they remembered. And that memory, passed down as fire, clothing, cooperation, and the slow perfection of survival strategies, was enough to keep their line going through the coldest dreams Earth ever had. This chapter of the story is not about transformation so much as persistence. Between 30,000 and 15,000 years ago, the planet entered its final deep freeze of the Pleistocene. Known as the Last Glacial Maximum, or LGM, this was the time when the ice reached its most ambitious extent. Northern Europe became a white desert. The Canadian interior vanished beneath an unbroken wall of glacier. Sea levels plunged as water locked into ice. Entire coastlines vanished. But as the sea receded, it also revealed bridges. Across what is now the Bering Strait, a cold, grassy expanse connected Siberia to Alaska. Australia and New Guinea merged into a single landmass called Sahul. Japan almost kissed the Korean peninsula. Even Britain was, for a brief geological blink, simply an extension of the European mainland. The continents reconfigured themselves in silence, and humans, small and warm-blooded and quietly persistent, followed the gaps and shadows. In the Mammoth Steppe, a vast corridor of frigid grasslands stretching from Western Europe through Siberia and into Alaska, Homo sapiens found a strange kind of fortune. The cold here was real and unrelenting, but the ecology was not barren. This steppe supported a bizarre abundance of megafauna. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer, cave lions, musk oxen, and more. The land was dry, wind-blown and open, a frozen savanna. For hunter-gatherers adapted to large game, it was a feast on ice. Archaeological sites like Kostenki in Russia, Dolny Vestonis in Czechia, and Sungia northeast of Moscow reveal the quiet ingenuity of these Ice Age survivors. At Kostenki, layered hearths, carved ivory, and dwellings of mammoth bone hint at a long continuity of knowledge and adaptation. At Dolny Vestonis, woven textiles imprinted into clay suggest the earliest known weaving, and at Sungia, a burial of two adolescents adorned with thousands of mammoth ivory beads speaks to social bonds that extended beyond life. Cold didn't erase culture. If anything, it deepened it. In the east, along the fringes of the Mongolian Plateau and the Amur River basin, similar adaptations took shape. Here too, humans hunted mammoths and horses, stitched tailored clothing, and created survival kits designed for mobility across snow-swept plains. Further south, in the ice-free parts of China, Southeast Asia, and the Indian subcontinent, humans continued living in warmer refugia. But even there, the colder global climate reshaped patterns of migration and resource use. Caves became storage vaults for tools and bones. Rivers, narrowed and slowed by climate, were still lifelines, and the forests shrank, replaced in many areas by open grassland. In Japan, humans clung to the coasts, hunting sea mammals and fishing. In Sahul, they adapted to arid deserts and montane forests. The oldest known site in the Australian Highlands, at Lake Mungo, continued to be used even through colder phases. These pockets of human persistence, scattered but overlapping, reveal a species able to flex across nearly every biome Earth could throw at it. Not because of strength, but because of memory, fire, and the quiet mastery of layered clothing. What exactly did they wear, these humans in the Ice Age? Sewing needles made of bone have been found at Upper Paleolithic sites across Eurasia. The presence of tailored, multi-layered clothing is inferred from the cold itself. Without it, survival would have been impossible. We find awls, scrapers, and hide processing tools in abundance. Clothing, like fire, became part of the body's extended memory. The skin no longer ended at the epidermis. It now wrapped in leather and fur and layered fibre. Every new stitch was a line of evolutionary poetry, a technology written with bone and sinew spoken in silence. And then there were the shelters. Though many Paleolithic people remained mobile, some groups in cold climates built semi-permanent dwellings using mammoth bones, wooden posts and hide. At Mazurich in Ukraine, circular huts made from mammoth skulls and tusks have been found, their interiors blackened from long-term fire use. These were not accidental campsites, they were homes, and in their soot-stained interiors something else flickered. Memory, kinship, the passing of knowledge from one brittle winter to the next. Migration during this period continued, but it slowed. As the cold peaked, the great highways of the Ice Age, rivers, valleys, coasts, became narrower, more treacherous. Still, humans found ways forward. They moved into the Americas, likely crossing Beringia sometime before 20,000 years ago, though evidence remains scarce and debated. They reached the tip of Patagonia not long after. They wrapped around the coastlines of India and swept inland into what is now Central Asia. With every new site they left traces, a hearth, a broken flake, the bone of a meal. Most of these traces were never meant to last, but enough have survived to tell us this much. Even at the edge of planetary habitability, humans kept going. Why? Not because they had to, but because they could. The last great freeze of the Pleistocene wasn't just a test of endurance, it was a rehearsal for everything that came next. When the ice finally began to melt, slowly, unevenly, chaotically, it revealed more than just land. It revealed that the species who had survived the cold was no longer just surviving. It had become something else, something restless, something curious, something dangerously good at remembering. And so the cold ended, or rather, it began to retreat. But the memory of it lingered, in bones hardened by scarcity, in mythologies of a great winter, in stories whispered beside fire about animals that no longer walked the earth, in the hidden DNA of frost-resistant metabolisms and compact limb proportions. And even now, tens of thousands of years later, you carry some of that cold inside you. The exact shape of your nose, the sensitivity of your skin to wind, the way your body stores fat, the craving for warmth and salt when tired. These are not modern quirks, they are echoes, fossils of survival. No single moment defines this chapter. There was no invention that changed everything overnight. No revolution, no sudden shift. Just fire, beads, flint, bone, shelter, and memory, stretched across generations like a line through the dark. Which leaves us, as always, with a question. If we had not endured that cold, if something had gone just a little differently, a winter longer than expected, a migration that failed, would there be anyone left to remember it at all? 15,000 years ago, the world began to thaw. What had once been locked in frozen silence was now shifting, dripping, surging into something unfamiliar. The glaciers that had defined the Pleistocene were retreating, and with their withdrawal came something almost stranger than the ice itself. Change. For the first time in tens of thousands of years, Earth was warming. and with that warmth came rivers where there had been only snowpack, forests where there had been tundra, and slowly, humans who stayed. The end of the last ice age was not a single moment. It was a chaotic, seesawing span of millennia that began around 15,000 years ago and finally stabilised near 10,000 years ago. Across the globe, climate began to behave differently, more erratically, less bound to glacial rhythms. It is called the Late Glacial Interstadial, a period of warming and ecological reorganisation that is difficult to overstate. Sea levels rose, animals migrated, vegetation exploded in places that had been barren for generations, and somewhere in this cascade of thaw and renewal, our species, already spread across every continent except Antarctica, began to live differently too, in what is now the Levant, particularly across modern-day Israel, Jordan and Syria. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of a culture that seems to hover on the edge of transformation. They are called the Natufians, and their remains span from around 14,500 to 11,500 years ago. These were still hunter-gatherers, technically, but not like the nomadic reindeer chasers of Ice Age Europe or the mobile foragers of tropical Africa. Natufian groups built stone houses. They used heavy mortars and pestles to process wild cereals. They returned to the same places again and again, year after year, and began to tether themselves to the land. This was not quite farming, but it was no longer roaming either. The ecological context of this shift is critical. As the ice melted, the Earth's hydrological system shifted dramatically. Rainfall patterns reorganised, river systems transformed, and ecosystems blossomed. The once patchy vegetation of the Levant turned into rich woodlands and grasslands. Wild barley, wheat, lentils and chickpeas grew in abundance across the hilly terrain. Herds of gazelle and aurochs roamed nearby, and with such bounty came the possibility, not yet the necessity, of staying put. This new semi-sedentary lifestyle brought with it innovations and challenges. The Natufians created microlithic tools that could be fitted into handles, shaped flint sickle blades for harvesting grain, and fashioned intricate bone tools. They buried their dead in formal graves, sometimes adorned with animal remains or red ochre. In some sites, they collected seashells from distant shores, suggesting either long-distance movement or trade. At Ain Malaha and other key settlements, circular stone houses were built partially underground with thatched roofs and central hearths. These were not camps, these were homes. But this new relationship with place was also fragile. Around 12,800 years ago, the climate turned again. The Younger Dryas, an abrupt return to near glacial conditions, froze parts of the northern hemisphere into a sudden cold snap that lasted more than 1,000 years. For communities like the Natufians, this meant collapse. Many of their settlements were abandoned, food sources declined, archaeological layers from this period show signs of nutritional stress. In some regions, the gathering of wild plants intensified. Others may have turned to small-scale cultivation, not as an invention of agriculture, but as a survival strategy. Whether the Younger Dryas was a forcing event or merely a hiccup in a larger trajectory, what followed was unmistakable. After 10,000 years ago, the Earth entered the Holocene, the epoch we live in today. The climate stabilised, forests matured, rivers swelled into predictable cycles, and across parts of the Near East, humans didn't just return to their previous way of life, they went further. They began to plant intentionally. They began to shape the landscape. They began to domesticate. But none of this was inevitable. The Natufians and their contemporaries were still tethered to the wild. They were not farmers. They were survivors in a world that was constantly shifting beneath their feet. What makes this period so striking is how delicately balanced it was. Between old and new, between movement and stillness, between gathering and cultivating. This was a time when the idea of staying began to compete with the instinct to roam. A time when the land began to shape the people as much as they had once shaped it with stone. And yet, even with all this context, one question remains. When the ice vanished and the rains returned, did the way we think change too? Not just our habits, but our minds. Did the rhythm of seasons give rise to something more patterned in ourselves? Did the return of green awaken a new kind of memory, a vision of what could be, not just what was? We do not know, but the earth remembers, and the roots of that memory still wind through every field we sow today. By the time the last of the glaciers had receded and the world began to thaw for good, Something new was happening, not just to the landscape but to the minds that moved across it. This wasn't quite the world of the hunters anymore, and it wasn't yet the world of the farmers. But in between there was a time when people did something even stranger. They adapted to abundance. This is the Mesolithic, a word that simply means middle stone, but underneath it lies one of the quietest revolutions in human history. For thousands of years, the story of survival had mostly followed the cold. Large mammals, long treks, and the pressure to keep moving. But with warming came a different challenge. Things stopped dying. Forests filled in the open steppe. Lakes and rivers swelled and stayed. Fish ran predictably. Herds moved more slowly. And for the first time, humans had to rethink what it meant to hunt in a world that no longer fled from them. So we did what we always do. We experimented. We got smaller, subtler, and smarter. The stone tools of this period don't shout, they whisper. Instead of massive hand axes or oversized blades, the Mesolithic gave rise to something more refined, the microlith. Tiny geometric flakes of stone, knapped with precision, and then fitted into shafts of bone or wood like puzzle pieces. These weren't designed for raw power, they were designed for speed, control, and repetition. With microliths came bows and arrows, not just to kill, but to choose. You could take down a single deer, not stampede a whole herd. You could aim for a duck in the reeds, or shoot upstream at salmon leaping against the current. The Mesolithic was the birth of selective hunting. It was also the age of the net, the line, and the hook. People stopped waiting for animals to come to them and started going after what lay beneath the surface. They built fish traps in tidal estuaries, laid woven baskets along migration paths, and crafted barbed harpoons from antler. The earliest hooks appear during this time, some carved from bone, some from shell. These were not tools for desperation. They were signs of patience, of a kind of planning that had more to do with rhythm than risk. If the Paleolithic mind was tuned to the pulse of the herd, the Mesolithic mind was tuned to the tides. And in this new rhythm, something extraordinary happened. We didn't just master other animals, we invited one of them in. Somewhere between 15,000 and 11,000 years ago, in a forest clearing or near a midden heap, a few bold wolves made a choice. They lingered. They stayed close. And a few curious humans chose not to chase them off. What followed wasn't a contract, or even a plan. It was something stranger. The slow entanglement of two species that would end up reshaping both of their destinies. The earliest archaeological evidence of domesticated dogs dates back to this Mesolithic zone. Sites like Bonn Castle in Germany or Uyun al-Hammam in Jordan show buried dogs alongside humans, treated not as meat or threat, but as kin. These dogs weren't bred for guarding livestock or pulling sleds. There were no herds yet, no ploughs to pull. These were companion dogs. Scavengers turned scouts, wolves turned watchers. They helped sniff out prey, warm the shelters, guard the perimeter. And perhaps most importantly, they changed the way we saw the wild. With a dog at your side, the forest stops being unknowable. You're no longer alone at night. There's a presence beside you that reacts to what you cannot yet see. The dog becomes an extension of your own alertness, and somewhere in that exchange, between human and canine, something like trust emerges. It's not symbolic, it's not spiritual, it's biological, and it lasts. We also started going farther, not just walking, but floating. Mesolithic people built the first canoes, simple dugouts, hollowed from tree trunks with controlled fire and stone adzes. We know this not only from direct finds like the Pes canoe in the Netherlands, dated to around 10,000 years ago, but from the proliferation of lake and river sites that imply regular movement by water. In regions like Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the Baltic, human activity during this period is clustered near coasts and inland waterways. These weren't just camps, they were networks. Fishing intensified, so did trade, so did memory. Because once you start using rivers as roads, ideas begin to flow faster than feet ever could. Tool styles diffuse. Decorative objects begin to appear in places far from their raw material source. And while Mesolithic people remain largely mobile, something subtle is changing. They start returning to the same places, seasonally, reliably. They cache food, they shape land, they watch the fish runs and time their movements to match. It's here that archaeologists begin to talk about sedentism without agriculture, People not yet planting crops, but living as if they might one day want to. This is not farming. It's not even the Neolithic. But it's a rehearsal for both. And within this rehearsal, some humans began to bury their dead. Not all the time, not consistently, but in some places, under certain circumstances, we see signs of ritual, of meaning layered onto the bones, ochre stains, antler grave goods, stone pendants. This isn't religion, it's something quieter. The suggestion that lives mattered. That memory might cling to a spot, even if the people did not. What does it take for a hunter-gatherer to bury the dead? It's a cost, a labour. And it tells us something about Mesolithic minds. These were not people living hand-to-mouth, forced into constant crisis. They had enough stability to mark absence, enough continuity to mourn. So what changed in us as the world warmed? We didn't build empires, we didn't write songs, but we began to live with rhythm, with returning rivers, loyal dogs, familiar trees. We began to think in loops, not just lines. And in that looping world, invention thrived. No one drew a blueprint for the Mesolithic, but out of warmth, out of stillness, out of long afternoons by the reeds, humanity did something that perhaps no other animal has done. It started to practice, not for war, not for worship, but for living. We were not yet domesticators, but we were close. We were not yet farmers, but we no longer chased. We were not yet home, but we stopped being lost. The Mesolithic mind isn't one that changed everything. It's one that waited. And in that waiting, it sharpened, not the stone, but the idea of what we might become. Because in the next world, the one coming just over the next hill, we wouldn't just find food, we'd try to grow it. And the experiment would begin again. Shall we? Why would a free species choose to plant itself in one place? For more than 90% of our history, humans did not grow food. They found it, hunted it, fished it, gathered it, moved to where it was, when it was. The idea of digging into the earth, putting a seed down, and waiting, staying, is so recent, so strange. It almost feels like forgetting how to be human. And yet, sometime between 10,000 and 7,500 years before the Common Era, in the hills and river valleys of the ancient Near East something changed, and the earth began growing a new kind of ape. The Fertile Crescent is not a place so much as a long, arcing memory of green. Stretching from the highlands of southeastern Anatolia through the plains of northern Syria, curving along the twin rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, it reaches toward the Zagros Mountains of western Iran. Today, it's often imagined as dry. But back then, the climate was softer. A moist, warm period followed the ice's retreat, and the region swelled with grasses, wild cereals and pulses. Gazelles moved through it in waves, and so did humans. And then, for reasons we're still only beginning to guess, some of them stopped. Archaeology names them the first farmers, but they didn't start with farms. Before there was wheat, there was emmer. Before there were ploughs, there were digging sticks. Before there were granaries, there were baskets, huts, pits in the ground. And before all of that, there was something more basic, an act of noticing. At sites like Abu Huraira, on the edge of the Euphrates, people had been gathering wild incorn wheat for thousands of years, and then, over time, the balance began to tip. In the oldest layers, seeds are almost all wild, but in the layers above, more and more are domesticated, not by magic, not even by plan, but by repetition. The tallest stalks got picked, the ones that shattered least stayed whole. The humans did not intend to evolve wheat. The wheat evolved humans. If there is a true beginning to the agricultural revolution, it is not a monument or a village. It is a shift in selection, a realignment of two species' survival logic. The grasses wanted to spread. The humans wanted to eat. And in the meeting of those desires, a kind of prison was built. At Jerf El Ahmar, a settlement dating to around 9,000 years before the Common Era, we find houses built of stone with round, sunken floors and benches along the walls. One of them, larger than the rest, has been interpreted as a communal gathering space, but nearby are buildings clearly used for grain storage. Grooves worn into basalt slabs suggest grinding of cereals. In other words, this was not just a place to eat food, it was a place to make it. But what did it cost? Farming brings food surpluses, yes, but those surpluses come with strings. Fields must be protected, crops must be harvested on time, pests arrive, diseases follow. Hunter-gatherers rarely suffered from cavities. Early farmers, gnawing on carbohydrate-rich cereals did. Their bones also show signs of stress, anemia, and sometimes shorter stature. The calories went up. The health, not always. Still, something else grew. Permanence. When humans began farming, they also began drawing tighter circles. Villages formed, roads appeared, and more than food, they began cultivating place. This didn't happen all at once. Farming took centuries to spread. Many groups kept moving, but the idea was seeded now, and it would never fully go away. By 8,000 years before the Common Era, farming communities appeared throughout the Levant, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. Wild barley and lentils became more uniform. Sheep and goats began to appear in greater numbers, but we'll speak of herding another time. What matters here is that a new relationship with the land had begun to take hold. No longer something to pass through, the earth became something to stay on, to measure, to fence, to rely on, and perhaps to fear. Drought now meant starvation. A bad harvest could ripple across seasons. Land ownership, though barely formed, hinted at inequality. Hierarchies began to rise, as did competition. But here's the strange part. For all its weight and consequence, the agricultural revolution was not inevitable. For thousands of years it was local, patchy, sometimes even abandoned. In the highlands of Iran, people continued to forage long after their neighbours sowed fields. In some places, cultivation began without permanent houses. In others, people settled before they farmed. The sequence wasn't linear. It never is. So why do it? Perhaps because once it starts, farming has a gravitational pull. It supports more people, which creates pressure to sustain them, which demands more food, which means more land. Over time, mobility becomes impossible, and what once was a choice begins to look like destiny. Even the tools began to change. Sickles made with flint microliths appear. Grinding stones multiply. Mud brick structures grow in size. Storage pits deepen. The rhythms of daily life shift. Where once people tracked herds and rainfall, now they tracked seasons, and eventually, time itself. This is the hidden revolution, not the seed, but the schedule. The slow transformation of human life from responsive to predictive, from scattered to rooted, from intuitive to planned. A mind that once measured movement by stars and smells now began to count days, dig ditches and prune branches. And somewhere in all of this, the wildness began to thin. Of course, it never vanished entirely. Forests still stood. Animals still wandered. People still hunted. But something had tilted. The centre of gravity was no longer the hunt. It was the harvest. The world would never quite be the same. And yet, if we could ask one of those early villagers why they did it, why they gave up freedom for grain, they might not say progress or future. They might just say, it worked, it fed the children, it kept us warm, and it gave us a reason to stay. But was it worth it? That, we're still deciding. It started with a look. Not a word, not a plan, just a glance across a clearing, a few thousand years of eye contact. Long before we had kings, books, cities, or clocks, our ancestors shared their lives with animals. Not by accident, not all at once, and not always on their terms. Somewhere between the wild and the tame, a pact was made, one that neither side fully understood, and it would shape everything that came next. By the 8th millennium before the Common Era, humans had already begun growing things. Seeds were no longer left to chance, but plants, no matter how carefully tended, could not move. Animals could. And so the next great gamble of the Neolithic began, not planting life into the earth, but inviting it into our homes, or more precisely into our settlements. Homes were still a bit of a stretch. The first animals that made the leap from wild to domestic were not random. Goats and sheep led the way, with pigs and cattle following soon after. These creatures were chosen not just because they were edible, though that certainly helped. They were chosen because they were flexible, biologically, behaviourally, and perhaps most importantly, socially. Herd animals were already accustomed to following a leader. All we had to do was become one. In the Zagros Mountains of what is now western Iran, archaeologists have uncovered goat bones dating to around 8,500 years before the Common Era. What makes them interesting isn't just their age, but their pattern. Many of the male goats were killed young, while females lived longer lives. That's not what happens in the wild. It is, however, what happens when a species is being managed. Too many adult males cause trouble. Fewer mouths, fewer fights. Similar clues appear across the Fertile Crescent. At sites like Sayonu and Ain Ghazal, bones from sheep and pigs show population profiles that no longer match natural herds. Juveniles dominate the record. This tells us two things. First, these animals were being bred intentionally. Second, they were being slaughtered selectively. Humans were now deciding not just when to kill, but when to let live. That is the beginning of domestication. But domestication is not the same as taming. A tamed animal learns to tolerate humans. A domesticated one is genetically altered by them, and that alteration runs deep. Over generations, domesticated animals become physically and neurologically different from their wild ancestors. Their skulls shrink, their ears droop, their coats change colour. They become less aggressive, more tolerant of crowding, more sensitive to human cues. In short, they begin to fit into our world. Goats became smaller and easier to manage. Sheep began to produce more wool and less coarse hair. Pigs became more compact, more fertile and more docile, though only just. Cattle took the longest, but once domesticated they offered everything: meat, milk, hide, labour. Each of these species underwent its own quiet revolution. They lost some of their wildness, and we, in return, gained control and responsibility. This exchange, however, was not one-sided. We shaped animals, but they shaped us too. The ability to digest milk, for instance, is not universal among mammals. Most stop producing the enzyme lactase after weaning, but in certain human populations, particularly in pastoral societies, a mutation allowing lifelong lactase production spread rapidly. This was not a natural adaptation. It was cultural evolution acting on biology, a clear case of gene culture coevolution. We bred the cows bred us. Beyond digestion, domestication changed our behaviour. Herding required planning, coordination and patience. It demanded long-term thinking, not just where to move next, but how to feed and protect a future generation of animals. This pushed our cognitive horizons outward. It also introduced a new relationship with violence. Predators now threatened not just our bodies, but our property. And so guarding became a new instinct, one that would echo into the structures of early society. But perhaps the strangest result of domestication was its emotional toll. For the first time in evolutionary history, a species learned to kill animals it had raised from birth. This wasn't hunting. It was something else, something more complicated. These were creatures that had faces, behaviours and relationships. Killing them required either detachment or ritual. In many Neolithic sites, we see signs of both. Select burials, carved bones, symbolic tokens, a kind of reverence, or maybe guilt. And the animals? They adapted in ways we still do not fully understand. The process of domestication remains one of the most mysterious in archaeology. It likely began not in pens but in gradients, semi-wild zones where certain individuals stayed close to human camps, pigs rooting near middens, goats loitering for salt. Over time, a feedback loop formed. The more we tolerated them, the more they tolerated us, until one day the boundary disappeared. By 6,000 years before the Common Era, domesticated animals had spread far beyond their original zones. Goats were climbing the rocky terraces of the Mediterranean. Sheep were grazing the cold grasslands of Central Asia. Pigs had reached China. Cattle were being managed in both Africa and the Near East. This was no longer a local experiment. It was a planetary transformation. The biosphere itself had begun to bend toward human will, and with it came something subtler, a shift in worldview. Once you rely on an animal for survival, your perception of it changes. It is no longer just food. It becomes a resource, a partner, a symbol, a mirror. Domesticated animals appear in early art, not just as prey, but as icons. Bulls carved in stone, goat motifs painted on walls. These were not decorations, they were part of the new order. Life now flowed through cycles of birth, growth, control, and culling. Still, not all animals crossed the threshold. Some refused, others we never tried. Domestication was a narrow gate, and only certain species fit through. It was not inevitable. It was an act of selection, both by us and by them. So did we domesticate animals? Or did they in some way domesticate us? The question still echoes, After all, the act of shaping another life form inevitably reshapes the one doing the shaping. We changed their genes. They changed our story. And in that story, one quiet fact remains. For tens of thousands of years, humans shared the planet with creatures they did not control. Then suddenly a few were brought into the circle, federal, bred named, and sacrificed. That is where power begins. Not with a sword or a crown, but with a pen or a leash. The Stone Age was never just about stones. It was about learning to manage the wild without fully leaving it behind. Animals were the first test. They would not be the last. So what came next, after animals lived among us and we among them? What happened when food no longer moved, when it stayed in the village and people followed it home? That story is waiting in the next breath of time, somewhere between the forests of ancient Japan, the slow rivers of the Yellow River Basin, and the upland rocks of the Levant. A peculiar thing began to appear. Fragments of hardened clay, shaped not by wind or erosion, but by the hands of people. Burnt, bubbled, and scarred by flame, these broken shells belonged to vessels that should not have existed yet. Because this was a time before cities, before wheels, before metal. And yet someone was already shaping mud into memory. For nearly 3 million years, humans and their ancestors used stone, bone, and fire. But clay, at least fireproofed clay, was something else. Soft, wet, pliable, but dangerously fragile when dried. It needed fire, but not just any fire. It needed heat high enough to harden it without destroying it. Somewhere in this strange tension, pottery was born, not suddenly, not all at once, but through a slow dance of experiment, accident, and insight, spanning continents and climates, long before agriculture had fully taken root. And it may have begun not in the great centres of civilization we often imagine, but in the edges, in fishing camps, forest clearings, and small fires lit by people who had no word yet for permanence. The oldest known pottery in the world comes not from the Fertile Crescent or the Nile Valley, but from Japan. At sites like Odai Yamamoto and Fukui Cave, tiny fragments of clay vessels appear as early as 16,000 years ago, with more recognisable Jomon pottery emerging between 14 and 12,000 years ago. These early pots are often simple, bag-shaped containers with cord-impressed patterns, a cultural signature so enduring that it gave the Jomon their name. And while later Jomon pottery would become wildly elaborate, twisting with flame-like coils and complex rims, the earliest pieces were practical. They were used to store, boil and ferment wild foods in a damp, forested world where preservation and portability mattered. The people who made them were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers. But something in their world, maybe the abundance of tubers, fish and acorns, or the seasonal rhythm of harvests, made pottery not just possible, but useful. A similar pattern emerges in southern China, where pottery shards from Jianrendong Cave date to around 20,000 years ago, and Yuchanyan Cave to around 18,000. Again, these were made by foragers, not agriculturalists, and again they were likely used to cook and store wild plants, roots, and maybe even fermented beverages. Some of the earliest pots in the world, in other words, come not from the Neolithic, but from the very tail end of the Pleistocene. This has led many archaeologists to rethink the relationship between pottery and farming. It used to be assumed that pottery came after agriculture as a kind of support system for sedentary, grain-storing lives. But the evidence tells a messier story. In many places, pottery came first. In the Middle East, pottery arrives later, roughly 9,000 to 8,000 years ago, in the so-called pre-pottery Neolithic, bee cultures of the Levant and Anatolia. These were early villages, often built of stone or mud brick with signs of domesticated grains and animals. Here, pottery seems to emerge in tandem with more settled life, and it quickly becomes central for cooking, storage, ritual, and even burial. The vessels are often round-bottomed, designed for hearth cooking, and sometimes decorated with painted motifs or carved incisions. But even here, pottery wasn't just a response to agriculture. It was a new way of thinking about material, about transformation, about what it meant to shape nature into culture. Because to make pottery, you don't just gather and shape clay. You have to know your fire. Too cool and the pot collapses. Too hot and it explodes. Somewhere in between, in that magic threshold of 600 to 800 degrees Celsius, the clay undergoes a permanent transformation. Its structure changes. its water content is lost, it becomes ceramic, and once that change happens, it cannot be undone. Pottery is permanent, fragile, yes, breakable, but no longer mutable. In a world defined by perishable things, wood, hide, bone, this permanence was radical. These were objects that could outlive their makers. This permanence may be one reason why pottery began to take on artistic and symbolic dimensions. Even in its earliest forms, pottery is often decorated. Not lavishly at first, but enough to show care. Finger grooves, chord impressions, small patterns etched with shells or reeds. As if to say, this is not just a container. It is an object that holds meaning, not just contents. Later traditions, from the linear band ceramic in Europe to the Ubaid culture in Mesopotamia, would elevate this further, turning pottery into a major artistic medium. But even the earliest pots, made by hand, without wheels or kilns, carry the imprint of individuality. No two are quite the same, and they may even reflect gendered knowledge. In many prehistoric and ethnographic contexts, pottery making is associated with women. This may have been true in the ancient world as well, especially in societies where women controlled the hearth, food preparation, and seasonal gathering. The knowledge of clay types, drying times, and firing techniques was likely passed down through generations, not in writing, but through touch, repetition, and intuition. Pottery, then, may not have been just a technological breakthrough, but a cultural thread, linking mothers to daughters, seasons to cycles, craft to identity. And in this way, the birth of pottery may also be the birth of something quieter, the idea that shaping the world can be personal. We often think of innovation as a leap, a flash of insight, a disruption. But pottery was not that. It was a slow boil, a long fermentation of ideas and observations, scattered across time and space, emerging in parallel in places as far apart as Kyushu and the Jordan Valley. It was not one invention, but many. And in that way, it mirrors the very nature of prehistory itself, diffuse, fragmentary, deeply human. Some pots held grains, some held meat, some held water. Some may have held the bones of the dead. Others held stories, not written, but implied, through patterns, handles, footings. Some broke in fire, some were buried, others shattered, and their pieces drifted into the layers of archaeological time, waiting for someone to find them. And when we do find them, we don't just learn about what people ate. We learn about how they thought about heat, shape, transformation, and permanence. Pottery is not just technology. It is intention, made durable. And this brings us to the haunting question. Why did so many different cultures, across such vast distances, invent this same fragile miracle? What were they really trying to preserve? Food, or something else? Because in every pot something remains, a fingerprint, a scorch mark, a trace of pigment, and in every hearth where clay once hardened there lingers a memory of someone who took earth in their hands and asked it to last. What does it mean when humans begin spinning time? It's one thing to gather, to hunt, to shape stone or bake clay, but it's something entirely different to imagine circular motion, to spin a wheel not once, but forever, to twist threads from plants, to bend flax into fabric, to pull meaning from the soft architecture of what one wears. These aren't just tools. These are metaphors turned real. The wheel and the loom mark the moment when humans stopped merely responding to the world and began rehearsing its rhythms. And as strange as it sounds, neither of these inventions came from metal, or kings, or cities. They came quietly, from the same Neolithic mines still surrounded by rivers, granaries, and goats. Somewhere between 7,000 and 4,000 years before the Common Era, in landscapes not yet gridded by empire, something spun. And it never stopped. The wheel is easy to take for granted now. It appears inevitable, as if the moment someone shaped a circle, transportation followed. But the archaeological record disagrees. Humans had sleds, skids, and log rollers long before the wheel. In fact, the earliest known wheel doesn't appear until around 5,500 years ago from a wooden specimen found near Ljubljana in modern Slovenia. It was a solid two-plank design with a thick axle. Heavy, awkward, and wildly innovative. But this wheel was not born in isolation. It arrived in the midst of clay pottery cultures, plough agriculture, and increasingly sedentary societies across the Eurasian Neolithic. In Mesopotamia, Some of the earliest depictions of wheels are not for transport but for shaping pots. The potter's wheel, in fact, may have predated the cart, suggesting the circle was first used not to move across the land but to mould it. And while the wheel was literal, carved from wood, fixed to axle, pulled by animals, the loom was something softer. It took threads and made them into continuity. The act of weaving was older than cities, older than most walls, and very likely older than the wheel itself. Impressions of woven fabrics appear in fired clay as early as 26,000 years ago in Pavlovian Upper Paleolithic sites in what is now the Czech Republic. But the Neolithic changed the scale and purpose of weaving. Plant fibres like flax, hemp and nettle were spun using spindles, tools as elegant as they were invisible, rarely surviving in the archaeological record except as weights and whorls. In the Near East and Europe, loom weights begin appearing by the 7th millennium before the Common Era. That suggests standing vertical looms, machines for turning thread into tapestry. And what were those textiles for? Warmth, yes, but also identity. Clothing for humans is never just protection, it is signal. Colour, weave and pattern reflect social position, group belonging, or personal preference. In the Neolithic, dyed fibres appear alongside grave goods, beads and jewellery. Some scholars have suggested that weaving, unlike stone flaking or metal casting, was more likely performed by women, a division of labour not absolute, but increasingly visible in iconography and grave rolls. The loom, then, was not just a machine, it was a mirror of social fabric. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, wheels and looms begin to show up together in early pictographic tablets. The Sumerians recorded not only wheeled carts and spinning devices, but also rations of textiles and fibre. This points to another transformation, the emergence of surplus as bureaucracy. To weave meant not only to clothe, but to count. And so the wheel, first a potter's turntable, then a cartwheel, and the loom, first a quiet task beside the hearth, became tools of the state, or at least of the structure that would one day be called a state. But long before taxes and writing, there was the human hand, twisting, pulling, rotating. Someone, somewhere, carved a circle and asked if it could turn. Someone else, perhaps by firelight, fed thread through warp and weft, not knowing that this simple tension would echo through every fabric in history. These inventions are often called technologies, but they are really metaphors made real. The wheel is time, the loom is memory, and the thread is what binds it all together. It's easy to imagine this moment. A group of humans no longer wandering, now seated by a structure they built themselves. Nearby, flax is drying. A wheel is creaking under the weight of a ceramic jar. Children watch thread pulled through notched wood, and for the first time in deep time, their clothing is not just practical. It is chosen. These were still people without bronze, without kings, without written law, but they were beginning to structure time, to wear it, to move through it. Civilization does not arrive all at once. Sometimes it spins slowly into being, and so the question lingers, was the wheel just about movement or about meaning? And when we learn to weave, were we binding fibres or the future? Before anything spun, before fabric covered skin or pottery lined a village wall, humans were already threading together ideas, not always with tools but with patterns, the memory of seasons, the shape of rivers, the movement of stars. Even before we built physical looms, we were weaving meaning, binding cause to consequence, past to present. There's something persistent about this instinct, to take thin things and join them into something thicker, longer lasting. That instinct didn't begin with cities. It began with fibre, friction, and patience. In some ways, thread was our first true infrastructure. Long before roads or wires, a single twisted plant strand represented connection, the joining of one moment to another, one person to another. Archaeological remains of ancient cordage stretch back tens of thousands of years, often made from bast fibres, grasses or sinew. These early cords tied together shelters, secured baskets, and wrapped the edges of memory. And as fibres got longer, so did the human timeline. A piece of woven cloth isn't just practical, it is durable language. The wheel, for all its simplicity, had to wait. It required more than just roundness. It demanded pairing, symmetry, balance, and a grasp of rotational friction. Until the Neolithic, no one seems to have imagined that a circle could become continuous motion. But once it did, it unleashed an idea that couldn't be stopped. Time itself could now be shaped. Spinning, turning, transporting. The world no longer had to be carried. It could roll. And so, just like that, the first circle became a rhythm. Not in the way planets turn, but in the human sense. Repetitive, controllable, mechanical. This is what made the wheel so radical. It wasn't just new, it was recursive. And in a quiet corner of the same Neolithic landscape, a parallel invention emerged. The spindle. A smaller circle, used not to move things, but to twist them. While the cartwheel carried weight, the spindle carried intention. Both began as tools of practicality. Both became tools of permanence. There is something gentle and unnoticed about weaving, which might be why it changed us so profoundly. You don't have to announce fabric the way you announce fire or stone. It enters softly. But once humans begin wrapping themselves in meaning, literal meaning, it becomes harder to say where function ends and story begins. The spindle, the loom, the dye pot. These were our first storytelling machines, and like all stories, they spread. Through contact, trade, imitation. The knowledge of how to twist flax, or cut a groove into a wheel hub, or balance a cart shaft over an axle. None of these innovations existed in a vacuum. Every one of them required teaching, and this meant, by necessity, the invention of instruction, not writing, not yet. But certainly explanation, gesture, memory, practice, repetition. Teaching someone how to spin thread or fit a spoke or tension a warp, that takes more than hands, it takes continuity. So when we say civilization began to spin, maybe it's not just a metaphor. When did fire stop just cooking and start transforming stone? Somewhere deep in the Neolithic world, between the 7th and 5th millennia before the Common Era, a few scattered human hands picked up something far older than them, a greenish rock, heavy in the palm, veined with reddish patches, smelling faintly of the earth it came from. This was native copper, and for the first time in human history, someone didn't just admire it. They hit it. They bent it. They tried to change it. Up until this point, fire was a companion. Warm, terrifying, useful, wild. It cooked our meat, scared off our predators, lit our caves, and slowly became a centerpiece of everything social. But something shifted when people started applying it not just to food, but to materials themselves. Not to survive, but to shape. What emerged from that slow realization was not a revolution, not yet, but a delicate edge, the edge of metal. A moment suspended between the Stone Age and everything that came after, when stone was still king, but other substances began to whisper possibilities. Native copper was unlike anything else in the natural world. It did not need to be extracted from ore through complicated chemistry. It was already pure, already metal. Nuggets of it lay exposed in some riverbeds and cliff faces, and its malleability was striking. When struck with stone, it didn't fracture, it dented, it changed shape. It behaved not like rock, but like something entirely new. Across parts of the Middle East, Southeastern Europe, and Central Asia, this metal began appearing in human sites, not in abundance, but with increasing curiosity. By the 6th millennium before the Common Era, small items made of copper, pins, beads, awls, start to emerge in the archaeological record. These weren't tools meant for conquest or agriculture. They were slow, personal, experimental. Most were made through cold hammering, that is, pounding native copper without heating it. It's a surprisingly simple idea, but it brought with it the beginnings of metallurgy. Hammer too much, and the copper becomes brittle. Heat it slightly, and it softens again. That lesson alone, that fire could reset the properties of a metal, was the beginning of a long, winding dialogue between human ingenuity and the stubbornness of the periodic table. What's striking is how long this edge lasted. For thousands of years, copper remained rare, ornamental, and mostly small scale. This wasn't yet the age of furnaces or forges. These early experiments were more like alchemy by accident, the outcome of curious minds testing limits. At sites like Çatalhöyük and Tel Magzalia, small hammered copper artifacts show up, often side by side with flint blades and obsidian points. Stone was still doing all the heavy lifting. Copper was strange, almost ceremonial. It hadn't proven itself yet. In some places, like the Iranian Plateau and the Balkans, we find early signs of smelting, not widespread, not industrial, but suggestive. A few lumps of copper slag, a few pieces of ore that seem to have been heated intentionally. But even here, nothing was uniform. There was no single discovery moment. No blacksmith standing triumphantly over a glowing ingot. Just centuries of small stumbles, of failure and iteration, of people noticing that fire left behind residues, that certain stones melted, that maybe, just maybe, stone wasn't the final word. What may have helped push these ideas forward was the rise of pottery. Once people began building kilns hot enough to fire clay, they also began generating temperatures high enough to alter ore. Not intentionally at first, but over time the dots started connecting. A few sherds of clay lined with metal traces, a few furnace pits with unexpected temperatures. These clues suggest that metallurgy didn't emerge from nothing. It was an extension, an evolution, of the technologies already in place for shaping other materials. Fire wasn't new, containers weren't new. But their combination started producing results that stone alone never could. What's perhaps most humbling about this entire phase of human experimentation is how slow it was. From the first hammered copper bead to the first reliably smelted tool took not years or even centuries, but entire millennia. There was no urgency, no arms race, just human beings living, watching, trying, failing, and trying again. And that tells us something powerful. Innovation wasn't always about need. Sometimes it was about wonder. In this long twilight of the Stone Age, we see humans not yet consumed by efficiency or empire, but still caught between curiosity and necessity. Copper wasn't better than flint for cutting. It dulled faster. It bent, but it was beautiful. And that beauty mattered. Some of the earliest copper items we find are decorative. Rings, bracelets, status symbols. A few were buried with their owners. Some were cached together as if in offering. It's as if early humans recognized that copper wasn't just a new tool. It was a new category, and yet the earth resisted. Most copper in nature isn't native. It's trapped in ore, locked inside rock. Extracting it would require not just fire, but control. Bellows, containment, timing. The chemistry of reduction. That part of the story hadn't arrived yet, so the edge of metal remained just that, an edge. One we approached slowly, cautiously, and unevenly. There was no universal uptake. In many parts of the world, especially outside the Near East and southeastern Europe, the Neolithic continued for thousands of years without even a whisper of copper. But where copper did appear, it quietly transformed the human sense of material possibility. It suggested that stone wasn't the final form of matter. That transformation didn't just belong to fire or to food. That the very earth could be changed, melted, reshaped, reimagined. And in that moment, something else shifted. Not just in our tools, but in our minds. We began to see nature not just as a setting, but as a set of systems that could be altered, reconfigured, unlocked. The age of stone was still with us, but something inside it was beginning to flicker. A glint that wasn't quite rock and wasn't quite ash. The first shimmer of everything metallic, still half buried in clay, still muffled by the slow pace of human hands. And maybe that's the most remarkable thing, that the journey to metal didn't start with conquest, or empire, or weapons. It started with a child picking up a strange green rock and asking what else it could be. With someone watching a fire flicker in a kiln and noticing a streak of red where none should be. With a hammer against copper, not for utility, but for curiosity. And from that impulse came everything that followed. So if the Stone Age ever ended, it did not do so with a bang. It cracked, it shimmered, it melted, it burned slow. It whispered that something else was possible. And we listened. And what happens next, once we master the shimmer and begin forging with it, will change the world forever. But are we sure we were ready for what came with it? For hundreds of thousands of years, stone had shaped the human experience. Chipped, flaked, ground, and polished. Tools of flint and obsidian had carved through bone and bark, hunted mammoth and mouse, hollowed canoes, and reaped the first wheat. And yet, stone could not be bent. It could not be melted. It broke when struck wrong and dulled quickly when worked hard. For all its utility, It obeyed gravity and fracture more than human will. But sometime after the 6th millennium before the Common Era, a few curious minds noticed something odd. Among certain riverbeds or at the foot of dry hillsides, under layers of soil scorched by cooking fires or lightning-struck trees, there were stones that did not behave like stone. Some glinted red or green in the sunlight, others could be shaped without shattering, and some, when placed too close to flame, wept. This was not stone, this was copper. And with it began the slow, stumbling, almost accidental end of the Stone Age. No one knows exactly where the first copper was deliberately smelted. Unlike the flashier revelations of later archaeology, there is no single tomb, no smoking gun, no palace archive that spells it out. Instead, the record is patchy, hesitant. A blackened pot here, a crucible fragment there, a few microscopic droplets of slag lodged in a hearth floor. The earliest evidence for controlled smelting may come from the highlands of modern-day Serbia, where sites like Belovod and Plochnik have revealed the remains of what look like clay furnaces and traces of molten copper dating back to the 6th millennium before the Common Era. Meanwhile, in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran, at a place called Tali Iblis, archaeologists have found copper slags dated to around the 5th millennium before the Common Era. Farther east in the Indus region, and westward in the Levant and southern Anatolia, similar clues appear, localized, scattered, unassuming. It is as if something invisible was dawning, not with a bang, but with a glow. To understand how strange this discovery must have seemed to its earliest practitioners, it's worth remembering what metal is. Unlike wood or stone, metal does not exist ready-made. Yes, native copper can be found in pure, malleable form, but it's rare, a kind of geological accident. Most of it is locked in ores, rocky composites of sulfur, oxygen and other minerals, dull to the eye, heavy in the hand, and utterly inert until subjected to the right temperature, for the right duration, under the right conditions. You cannot stumble into metallurgy by accident. You must be curious, persistent, slightly reckless, and you must have a fire, not just any fire, but one hot enough to reach over 1,000 degrees Celsius, far beyond the warmth of a cooking hearth. How did this happen? The answer may lie in pottery. By the early 5th millennium before the Common Era, many Neolithic communities were already skilled in shaping and firing ceramic vessels. To fire a pot well, one must learn to build kilns, enclosed chambers that channel air, insulate heat, and sustain controlled burns. Once that infrastructure was in place, perhaps someone tossed a lump of green malachite into a clay-lined fire pit, only to find that, after many hours and a generous bellows, the ore turned to metal. A miracle born from craft. But miracles are rarely solitary. Once the technique was discovered, it spread, not rapidly but steadily along the arteries of exchange and imitation. Small copper items began to appear. Beads, pins, hooks, chisels, and awls. These were not mass-produced, nor were they replacements for stone. They were special. Their shimmer carried meaning. In burials and hoards, copper objects seemed to have signalled prestige more than practicality. At first, copper was too soft for cutting trees or skinning hides, but it was new, rare, and shine mattered. Like the first textiles, like ochre before it, copper had aura. That began to change once smelting became more routine. By the late 5th millennium before the Common Era, people in places like the Tisapolgar culture of the Carpathian Basin and the Vinča culture of southeastern Europe were not just experimenting with copper, they were producing it. In the Balkans, entire workshops emerged, with slag heaps meters thick, indicating sustained metallurgical activity. Along the edges of the Fertile Crescent, similar traditions took hold, adapted to local geology and knowledge. Metallurgy was no longer just a curiosity. It was an occupation, a process, a tradition with rules. The act of smelting itself required more than fire. It required infrastructure. Crucibles, clay vessels capable of withstanding intense heat, had to be shaped and dried, designed with spouts for pouring. Furnaces had to be built, insulated with ash or broken potsherds. Charcoal had to be sourced since wood alone could not generate the necessary temperature. And someone had to work the bellows. This was not light work. It was loud, smoky, back-breaking labour, more alchemy than industry. To get a handful of metal, one needed to crush kilograms of rock. Sometimes it failed. Ores were contaminated. Crucibles cracked. Impurities weakened the final ingot. Metallurgists were not wizards. They were experimentalists, tinkerers with fire. Over time, they got better. The copper became cleaner, more consistent. Tools moved from ornamental to functional. Axes, blades, and adzes began to rival their stone counterparts, not in raw cutting power, but in refashionability. Copper tools could be repaired, recast, sharpened anew. Stone tools could not. And while copper never replaced flint completely during this period, it began to challenge its supremacy. Slowly, the Stone Age met its match not with a war, but with a whisper. The whisper of metal cooling in the night. Still, this was not yet the age of empires or armies. No large-scale bronze casting, no smelting complexes with dozens of workers. The metallurgy of this era remained intimate, household scale, dependent on regional geology and generational know-how. It was a quiet revolution. In parts of what is now southeastern Europe, for instance, archaeologists have unearthed small copper ingots stashed in the corners of homes, near loom weights or spindle whorls. It suggests that metalwork was not yet fully separated from domestic life. The first metallurgists were not necessarily full-time specialists. They may have been mothers, fathers, weavers, farmers, people with many tasks for whom metallurgy was a seasonal or ceremonial skill. Perhaps this is the real mystery. Not that humans discovered how to turn rock into metal, but that they did so before they needed to. Copper at this stage was not yet a weapon. It did not feed villages or change how people hunted. Its emergence was less about necessity than imagination. It was not the strongest material available, but it was the most enchanting. And in the end, that may have been enough. So we're left with a question. Why did they keep doing it? Why keep melting stone if it was easier to carve flint? Why brave the smoke, the failures, the endless hours at the fire? Because something changed when metal flowed. The earth no longer gave up its gifts in finished form. Now, we had to extract them, refine them, shape them through violence and care. In doing so, humans crossed a boundary, not just technical, but symbolic. For the first time, we weren't just using nature, we were transforming it, rewriting the rules of what matter could do, and that shift, once begun, would never quite stop. The Stone Age was ending. But it didn't know it yet. The ground still held secrets, and one of them, very soon, would be bronze. Long before metal glowed in crucibles or copper beads adorned the dead, humans had already learned to coax the earth into transformation. Fire, pottery, pigments, each represented a small defiance of nature's original state. Clay became stone, ash became colour, seeds became rose. So perhaps the idea that stone itself could be made to weep and run like water wasn't so unthinkable after all. What made metallurgy different was not just the heat or the difficulty, it was the mindset. This was no longer about finding what the world gave freely. It was about pulling something unnatural from the natural, turning ore into substance. In a way, metal was the first material that didn't exist until we made it, and yet the earliest metallurgists didn't announce themselves as a new species of craftsmen. They weren't revolutionaries. They were curious people, living in the same houses as everyone else, farming the same fields, weaving the same baskets. They just happened to spend more time near fire, near the riverbeds where unusual green stones clustered, and near the blackened pits where rock sometimes betrayed a shimmer. What they were doing may have looked like magic, but it wasn't. It was repetition, risk, burned fingers, broken crucibles. That's how innovation usually begins, not with genius, but with stubbornness. And so, slowly, the process stabilised. Copper began to behave more predictably. The first hammer marks were replaced by the first melt lines. Metallurgy went from accident to habit. It didn't yet rule the world, but it no longer belonged only to chance. It had entered the human repertoire. One more way to change the world by understanding what lay beneath it. That's where the story of copper ends. But it's also where something more dangerous begins. The metal wasn't always used for beauty. Soon, it would be shaped to bite back. If you were standing on the banks of the Tigris around the year 3000 before the Common Era, you might think the Stone Age had finally given way. The glow of kilns, the smell of smelting, the sharp glint of new metals in freshly cast blades and chisels, these were the signatures of a world tilting towards something new. Copper had been hammered, reshaped, and tested. Tin had been found. Bronze had begun to flow. And yet, for most of the Earth, the Stone Age did not end, not that year, not even that millennium. The phrase Stone Age suggests a clear border, a line that can be crossed. But human cultures are not geological epochs. They do not end everywhere at once. They fracture, blend, persist. For every pot in Mesopotamia hardened by heat, there were still people in the forests of Europe knapping flint. For every bronze tool emerging in Anatolia, someone in the Andes was still carving with obsidian, not because they were behind, but because the mountains offered what they needed. The Stone Age in truth never vanished. It simply began to live in parallel. Obsidian, for example, may be volcanic glass, but in human hands it became something almost surgical. As early as 7,000 years ago in the Americas, flakes of obsidian were being shaped into scalpels capable of splitting flesh cleaner than any modern steel. In Ethiopia and Kenya, obsidian tools have been found in sites from the Neolithic right up to the Iron Age, tools that were not cast aside when metal arrived, but used in tandem, chosen for their edge, their purity, their ease of control. Even today, in high-precision surgeries, surgeons sometimes reach back to obsidian blades when only the cleanest cut will do. That is not a relic. That is a cohabitation of time. In Japan, flint knapping continued into the historic period, long after bronze and iron had spread. In Australia, many Aboriginal groups continued crafting stone tools into the modern era, often for ceremonial purposes, but also because in some ecosystems, stone simply remained the best choice. Across the Arctic, the Inuit perfected stone and bone tools that functioned flawlessly in a frozen world that punished metal with brittleness. The Stone Age did not die. It specialized. Even within so-called advanced societies, stone retained a symbolic pull. Think of the cornerstone, not the copper stone or the bronze stone. We still commemorate permanence by placing a shaped piece of the earth into our architecture. We still call the foundation of something set in stone. When we want to signify something timeless, we do not melt it. We chip it from bedrock. Modern flint knappers today, archaeologists, experimentalists, even hobbyists, have resurrected the techniques of Clovis point making, of Levallois flake strategies, of pressure-flaked obsidian microblades. These are not reenactments. They are experiments in remembering. Because the Stone Age, far from being a primitive void, was an age of innovation, of subtle material genius, of skills honed over hundreds of thousands of years. And those skills never truly disappeared. They were stored, like seeds under ash. And in some places, they were never buried at all. On the island of New Guinea, stone tools were still actively used in farming and construction into the 20th century, shaped and sharpened by hands that had never stopped knowing how. In the highlands, people used stone axes not because they had never seen metal, but because stone still worked. It was strong, it was local, it was theirs. So when we speak of the end of the Stone Age, we are really speaking about a shift in materials that unfolded unevenly, unevenly acknowledged, unevenly distributed. Some valleys lit up with the shimmer of molten copper. Others remained dark but not silent. They echoed with the strike of flint, the shaping of quartz, the whisper of edge against bark. And even now we carry those echoes. Every person who has ever struck a lighter, chipped a flake from a fire starter, or snapped a piece of glass to cut a thread, they're tapping into something older than kings, or cities, or writing. They are living proof that the Stone Age is not a forgotten past. It is a foundation, folded beneath us. What other age, after all, lasted so long? For over 3 million years, humans and our ancestors survived, even thrived, in a world shaped by stone, bone, sinew, and fire. For 99% of our existence, we were stoneworkers, and even in a world of satellites and circuits, that memory clings to us like dust. So maybe the Stone Age never really ended. Maybe it simply became quieter, buried not in the ground, but under layers of language, tools, and assumptions. But it is still there. In every obsidian blade in a surgeon's kit, in every rock art panel that has outlasted entire civilizations, in the hum of flint knapping echoing through an archaeological field school, in the knowledge that even without machines, without wires, without anything but hands and thought, humans shaped the world. The question is not when the Stone Age ended. The question is how much of it we still carry, quietly, in the bones. Even in today's most digitized corners of life, some of us still nap. Some of us still shape stone, not out of necessity but out of reverence, out of a quiet hunger to feel what it felt like to hold time in the hand. At flint-napping gatherings from North America to Europe to the Australian bush, people strike cores with antler billets, pressure flake obsidian with copper nails, and try to remember how it felt to invent form from fracture. They are not reenactors, they are memory keepers, because every tool we've ever built still holds a ghost of the first one, not a spirit but a physics, a friction, a knowing. Even glass, our modern artificial stone, still cuts like obsidian when cooled right. In emergency rooms, when a doctor's scalpel needs to go deeper than steel allows, a sliver of volcanic glass, shaped in silence and darkness like it was 50,000 years ago, may be the only tool precise enough. In a world of quantum computers, sometimes the edge that saves a life is still born in fire and flaked by hand. The Stone Age did not vanish. It settled into our metaphors, our muscle memory, our sense of durability. We still measure epochs with stones, stepping stones, gravestones, milestones. A stone marks where something begins, or ends, or mattered. In that sense, every stone tool ever made was not a primitive object. It was a sentence, chipped into time by a species trying to last. So perhaps the Stone Age ended on a calendar, but it never ended in us. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do, like subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.